The Theosophical Society. Written by Alana Sanchez. Narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Preface. The Theosophical Society, founded in New York City in 1875, occupies a peculiar and often misunderstood position in the intellectual and spiritual history of the modern world. It is routinely filed away under convenient labels: occult, New Age precursor, Victorian eccentricity, Orientalist fantasy. Yet it stubbornly resists reduction. The Society was never wholly a religion, nor merely a philosophical school, nor simply an occult fraternity. It emerged instead at the intersection of science, empire, comparative religion, print culture, reform politics, and the 19th century's accelerating sense that the world was changing faster than inherited meaning could keep pace. To understand Theosophy's rise is therefore to confront the anxieties and aspirations of the 19th century itself, an era of breathtaking technological progress alongside profound metaphysical uncertainty, of imperial confidence shadowed by moral discomfort, of Christian orthodoxy publicly challenged by geology, evolutionary biology, and historical criticism, and of an expanding educated public hungry for explanations that could connect facts to values, progress to purpose, and knowledge to ethics. This manuscript is concerned neither with advocacy nor with debunking. Its aim is historical explanation. It asks how and why the Theosophical Society came into being, what it claimed to represent, how it organized itself and propagated ideas, and what lasting consequences it had for religious thought, colonial encounters, modern esotericism, and the wider culture of spiritual seeking. Theosophy is treated here as a cultural phenomenon rooted in its time, shaped by identifiable people, networks, institutions, and historical pressures, rather than as a purely internal spiritual narrative or a simple cautionary tale of credulity. A movement born from fracture. The 19th century was an age of fracture. The authority of Christian cosmology, long the dominant moral framework across Europe and its settler colonies, was steadily eroded by the cumulative force of scientific and scholarly developments. Deep time in geology stretched the Earth beyond biblical chronologies. Darwinian evolution proposed that life's diversity, including human life, could be explained through gradual, impersonal processes rather than special creation. Philology and historical criticism treated sacred texts as layered, human products shaped by time and politics, rather than unmediated divine dictation. Yet this was not an age of simple secularization. It was an age of spiritual experimentation. Spiritualism promised empirical proof of survival after death, offering the parlor seance as a kind of popular laboratory. Mesmerism and hypnotism destabilized tidy models of mind and will. Secret societies, hermetic revivals, and esoteric fraternities offered symbolic orders of meaning that claimed ancient lineage and hidden knowledge. Psychical research, increasingly organized and method-oriented, tried to investigate contested phenomena with the tools of disciplined inquiry. This contested terrain, where science and metaphysics jostled for explanatory authority, was Theosophy's native environment. The founders of the Theosophical Society were not simply fringe eccentrics. They moved within the intellectual and media networks of their day. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the Society's most influential and controversial figure, drew upon European esoteric traditions, Russian intellectual currents, and a wide, often idiosyncratic, range of Asian religious ideas circulating in translation. Henry Steele Olcott, a former American military officer and journalist, brought organizational discipline, reformist zeal, and public credibility. William Quan Judge, lawyer and mystic, offered doctrinal interpretation and, crucially, institutional continuity in the United States when the Society's center of gravity shifted to India. Together they articulated an ambitious proposition, that beneath the diversity of world religions lay a single ancient wisdom religion, that humanity was governed by universal moral laws such as karma and reincarnation, and that spiritual development could be understood as a form of evolution, parallel to, but not reducible to, biological change. These ideas were not entirely new. What was new was the way the Theosophical Society systematized them, institutionalized them, and circulated them across continents through lodges, journals, lecture tours, and a rapidly expanding print network. Theosophy and empire, the necessary context. One of the central arguments of this work is that Theosophy cannot be understood apart from empire. The Society's relocation of its headquarters to India in 1879 was not merely a logistical choice, it was a symbolic realignment. In the colonial imagination of many Europeans and Americans, India represented a repository of primordial spiritual knowledge. Ancient, profound, and, in fantasy at least, uncontaminated by modern materialism. Theosophy drew upon that imagination, but it also challenged parts of the colonial hierarchy by publicly elevating Hindu and Buddhist traditions as philosophically serious and spiritually sophisticated. This produced complex and often contradictory outcomes. On the one hand, Theosophy contributed to the global circulation of Hindu and Buddhist concepts, supported certain educational projects, and sometimes offered Indian reformists and intellectuals a language of dignity and universality that could be deployed against missionary contempt and racialized assumptions of cultural inferiority. On the other, Theosophy often interpreted living traditions through Western esoteric frameworks, sometimes reproducing Orientalist stereotypes or asserting interpretive authority over cultures and communities it claimed to honor. These tensions are explored throughout the manuscript not as retrospective moral verdicts, but as historically situated dynamics, shaped by the asymmetries of colonial power, translation, patronage, and public credibility. Credibility, controversy, and the Victorian court of evidence. Theosophy's public life was inseparable from controversy. From the beginning, the movement carried a risky burden. It did not merely offer philosophical arguments, it also circulated claims of contact with hidden masters, or Mahatmas, and contact with unexplained phenomena that seemed to sit at the borderlands of accepted science. This placed Theosophy in the harsh light of Victorian credibility culture, where newspapers, missionaries, skeptics, and investigative societies all contested what should count as evidence and who should count as a trustworthy witness. The crisis of 1884 to 1885, centered on the Coulomb allegations at Udyar and the Society for Psychical Research's Hodgson Report, became a defining episode. The purpose of this manuscript is not to adjudicate metaphysical truth claims or to issue courtroom-style conclusions about phenomena. Instead, it asks historically why such claims were compelling to so many educated people across Europe, America, India, and the settler colonies. How those claims were organized into an institution, how opponents mobilized evidence against them, and how the movement adapted when public judgment turned hostile. One of the most revealing features of the Theosophical story is that Theosophy did not disappear under scandal. It reoriented. It shifted emphasis from spectacular phenomena to doctrine, study, and large-scale synthesis, most notably through Blavatsky's later writings and the creation of more structured inner teaching environments. This process illuminates a broader theme of modern spiritual movements. Survival often depends not on winning controversies, but on developing forms of meaning that can endure even when charismatic authority is destabilized. Women, reform, and the politics of spiritual authority. Theosophy's transnational impact cannot be separated from its social forms. The Society's stated commitment to universal brotherhood and spiritual equality resonated with reformist currents of the late 19th century, including movements concerned with education, labor, and women's public participation. Women in particular found in Theosophy opportunities for leadership and intellectual engagement that were often denied within mainstream churches and universities. Annie Besant's later prominence, spiritual organizer, educator, and political figure, illustrates both Theosophy's enabling possibilities and its vulnerabilities, especially when spiritual narratives became entangled with public prophecy and political struggle. Theosophy also provides an unusually clear window into how modern spiritual authority is built and contested. It blended organizational bureaucracy with charismatic claims. It fused scholarship with revelation. It relied on print culture while repeatedly insisting that truth must be personally discovered rather than imposed. These tensions between openness and hierarchy, skepticism and faith, evidence and esoteric authority, are not incidental. They are the very shape of the movement. Method, terminology, and limits. Methodologically, this study draws upon intellectual history, religious studies, colonial history, and the history of science. It uses published theosophical texts, organizational documents, private correspondence where available, contemporary journalism, and later scholarly interpretation. Wherever possible, primary sources are allowed to speak in their own voice, revealing both aspiration and limitation. Care is taken to distinguish between Theosophists' self-representations and later historians' reconstructions. Terminology follows historical usage with clarification where needed. Words such as Orientalism, occult, esoteric, race, science, and even religion carried meanings in the 19th century that do not map neatly onto contemporary assumptions. The aim is to make those meanings legible without either sanitizing them or sensationalizing them. Finally, it is worth stating plainly what this manuscript does not attempt. It does not attempt to prove or disprove metaphysical claims. It does not treat Theosophy as either a secret truth tradition or a purely fraudulent enterprise. Instead, it treats Theosophy as historically consequential. It asks what the movement did in the world, how it shaped modern ideas about spiritual evolution, comparative religion, the authority of Eastern wisdom, and the possibility that meaning might survive the collapse of old certainties. Why Theosophy still matters. Theosophy was not a fleeting curiosity. It was a transnational movement whose influence extended into literature, education, psychology, art, and politics. Elements of its worldview later re-emerged, sometimes recognizably, sometimes in diluted form, in 20th century alternative spirituality, and in the broader modern assumption that spiritual truth might be plural, comparative, experiential, and oriented towards personal development rather than institutional obedience. Ultimately, this manuscript argues that the Theosophical Society should be understood as a product of modernity rather than a rejection of it. Its founders did not flee the modern world. They attempted to reinterpret it. They sought a cosmology capable of accommodating scientific discovery, evolutionary time, cultural diversity, and moral law within a single meaningful narrative. Whether they succeeded is open to debate. That the attempt mattered, socially, intellectually, and historically, is beyond question. In examining the Theosophical Society, we gain insight into a broader human endeavor, the search for coherence in a world where old certainties fractured, but new ones had not yet settled. The story that follows is therefore not only about Theosophy. It is about the modern condition itself, its hunger for explanation, its battles over credibility, its encounters across cultures, and its ongoing effort to reconcile knowledge with meaning. Chapter 1. A World in Transition. Modernity, Crisis, and the Search for Hidden Order. The Theosophical Society did not appear in history as a strange accident, nor as a purely private invention of a few eccentric personalities. It emerged at a particular moment when the intellectual foundations of Western society were shifting rapidly, and when old certainties, religious, moral, and cosmological, were under sustained pressure. To understand why Theosophy could attract educated followers, provoke fierce criticism, and spread across continents within a few decades, one must begin with the wider conditions that made such a movement plausible. Theosophy was both a response to modernity and a product of it, an attempt to restore coherence without returning to orthodoxy, to preserve meaning without rejecting science, and to speak about spiritual experience in the language of progress. This opening chapter sets the stage. It outlines the 19th century's crisis of authority, the growth of comparative approaches to religion, the expansion of print culture, and the new fascination with borderland phenomena, mesmerism, spiritualism, and psychical investigation, that blurred the line between scientific inquiry and metaphysical hope. The aim is not to claim that Theosophy was inevitable, but to show why it made sense to many people at the time, and why it could be marketed as both modern and ancient. 1. The 19th century as a crisis of explanation. By the middle of the 19th century, the intellectual landscape of Europe and North America was being reshaped by developments that were not merely technical discoveries, but direct challenges to inherited narratives about humanity's place in the universe. Geology undermined traditional chronologies. The Earth, it became increasingly clear, was not a few thousand years old, but unimaginably ancient. Strata spoke of deep time, slow change, and immense spans that dwarfed the biblical timeline. Biology, through evolutionary theory, proposed that species were not fixed creations, but historical products shaped by natural processes. Human beings, long framed as uniquely fashioned and morally central in a divinely arranged world, were increasingly described as part of nature's continuum. Philology and historical criticism, meanwhile, treated sacred texts as layered documents shaped by human hands and historical circumstance. The Bible could still be revered, but it could no longer be read only as timeless revelation without encountering scholarly dispute. For many educated Victorians, these developments did not abolish religion, but they destabilized its authority. The very categories through which people had understood truth, revelation, tradition, clergy, ecclesiastical hierarchy, seemed less secure than they had been. Public debate intensified around a fundamental question. If traditional religion is no longer the uncontested framework for reality, what replaces it? Scientific materialism offered one answer. It promised that the world could be explained entirely through matter, energy, and physical law. This approach produced extraordinary technological and medical advances, and it carried the prestige of predictive power. Yet it also generated unease. For many, the materialist universe felt cold, indifferent, and morally mute. If consciousness is reducible to brain processes, if love is chemistry, if death is extinction, then what becomes of meaning, ethics, and hope? The 19th century's crisis was therefore not merely a battle between religion and science. It was a crisis of explanation itself. How to interpret human life in a cosmos that seemed to expand while its moral center contracted. Theosophy entered this crisis as a proposal that modern knowledge need not lead to nihilism. Its founders insisted that there were laws beyond the physical, moral and spiritual laws as real as gravity, and that modernity's intellectual tools could be used to recover them. It presented itself not as a retreat into superstition, but as an expanded rationality, a science of the soul, a philosophy of evolution, and a comparative religion that could reveal an underlying unity beneath cultural difference. 2. Secularization and spiritual experimentation. Not opposites but companions. It is tempting to describe the 19th century as a march towards secularization, but this framing misleads. The period did not simply trade religion for science. Rather, it produced a turbulent mixture. Declining confidence in orthodox institutions alongside growing fascination with alternative spiritual forms. This was the age of seances, table-turning, spirit photography, and mesmerist trances. It was also the age of new churches and revitalized sects, of esoteric revivals and pseudo-ancient fraternities, of charismatic healers and itinerant lecturers. Religious life did not disappear, it diversified. When authority fractured, it created space for experimentation. People sought experiences that could be felt and witnessed, not only preached. They wanted proof, not necessarily proof in the laboratory sense, but proof that the universe was more than dead matter. Spiritualism is central to this story. Beginning in the 1840s and spreading rapidly, spiritualism offered a compelling narrative. That communication with the dead was possible, and that this possibility could be demonstrated through repeatable phenomena. Many spiritualists framed their practice as scientific religion, arguing that the afterlife was not a matter of faith, but of observation. Mediums became cultural celebrities, seances became social events, and debates about fraud and authenticity became a staple of public life. Crucially, spiritualism attracted not only the credulous but also the educated, including individuals who were dissatisfied with orthodox religion but unwilling to accept materialism. Mesmerism and hypnotic phenomena also played a role. The suggestion that the mind could enter altered states, display unusual abilities, or reveal hidden layers of consciousness challenged conventional psychology and physiology. These practices contributed to a growing belief that human beings possessed latent capacities not yet explained by mainstream science. Theosophy would build upon this environment. It inherited spiritualism's appetite for evidence but criticized its tendency to treat phenomena as entertainment or to interpret everything as spirits of the dead. Theosophists claimed that many seance phenomena were real but misinterpreted, arising from subtle forces, psychological projection, or non-human intelligences. In doing so, they positioned themselves as both skeptical and enchanted, willing to believe in extraordinary phenomena, but determined to impose a system upon them. 3. The rise of borderland sciences and the problem of credibility. One of the most striking features of the late 19th century was the emergence of organized attempts to study contested phenomena. If the public could not agree whether mediumship was fraud or revelation, some concluded the answer should be pursued through disciplined investigation. This impulse contributed to the formation of psychical research societies and to a broader borderland culture in which the boundaries of science were debated. The Society for Psychical Research, SPR, founded in London in 1882, is a key example. It sought to examine claims of telepathy, apparitions, mediumistic phenomena, and other extraordinary experiences using methods that its members considered rigorous. Some investigators approached the subject with sympathy, others were skeptical. But the very existence of such organizations indicates how porous the lines between science, philosophy, and spiritual longing could be. Theosophy navigated this borderland by claiming a different kind of expertise. The founders argued that ordinary scientific instruments were insufficient for investigating spiritual realities, and that inner development was itself a research method. They did not reject science. They attempted to expand its scope. This move was rhetorically powerful, but it carried an obvious vulnerability. It placed authority in the hands of those who claimed special access. The question of credibility, who can be trusted, and what counts as evidence, therefore became central to Theosophy from its earliest years. That credibility question was also shaped by the wider Victorian culture of exposure. Newspapers thrived on scandal. Public intellectual life was often combative. Debunking was entertainment, and spiritual fraud was a recurring public drama. Any movement that claimed hidden wisdom or extraordinary phenomena was likely to face accusation, investigation, and ridicule. Theosophy would experience these pressures intensely, culminating in high-profile controversy later in its history. 4. Empire, translation, and the invention of the East in the Western imagination. If the 19th century was a crisis of Christian authority, it was also the height of European imperial expansion. Empire did not merely reorganize economies and politics, it reorganized knowledge. Colonial administrators, missionaries, scholars, and travelers produced vast bodies of writing about colonized peoples, religions, and languages. This writing was often shaped by domination and stereotype, yet it also facilitated unprecedented access, through translation and scholarship, to Asian texts that had previously been marginal in European intellectual life. By the mid to late 19th century, Hindu and Buddhist concepts were becoming more visible to Western readers. Translations of sacred texts, travel narratives, and scholarly works introduced ideas such as karma, reincarnation, nirvana, yoga, and meditation into public discourse, often in partial or distorted forms. For some Western readers, these ideas offered an alluring alternative to Christian dogma and to materialist despair. The East came to be imagined as spiritually deep, ancient, and mysterious, sometimes as a corrective to Western modernity's perceived emptiness. This imagination was not innocent. It often involved projection, constructing an East that served Western needs rather than representing living traditions accurately. Such projection is what later scholars would call Orientalism, a pattern in which the East is treated as a symbolic resource, exotic, timeless, spiritual, while real people and complex societies are simplified or ignored. Theosophy sits squarely within this imperial knowledge environment. It drew heavily upon Asian religious ideas and claimed special insight into their hidden meanings. It publicly defended Hinduism and Buddhism against missionary contempt, and it helped elevate Asian traditions within Western spiritual discourse. Yet it also interpreted these traditions through Western esoteric categories and sometimes asserted interpretive authority over living religious communities. Theosophy, therefore, exemplifies the ambivalence of empire-era spiritual exchange. Admiration entangled with power, curiosity entangled with projection. 5. Print culture, lecture circuits, and the making of spiritual publics. Another crucial precondition for Theosophy's rise was the expansion of mass print culture. The 19th century saw a dramatic increase in newspapers, magazines, pamphlets, and cheap books. Literacy expanded, and so did the idea of a reading public. Religious debate and scientific controversy were not confined to elite institutions. They became popular entertainment and civic conversation. This environment created what might be called spiritual publics, communities of interest formed through reading and discussion rather than through geographic proximity or church membership. People could become devoted followers of an idea or movement through periodicals and lecture transcripts. They could encounter arguments, counter-arguments, and testimony from far away. For movements like Theosophy, this was essential. A transnational organization could be built not only through physical lodges but through shared texts, shared debates, and a shared sense of participating in a global conversation. Lecture circuits also mattered. Public speaking was a major form of education and entertainment, and itinerant lecturers could draw large audiences. Theosophy would make heavy use of this cultural form, presenting itself as intellectually serious and morally purposeful. Public lectures allowed Theosophists to reach beyond private circles and to recruit members who were dissatisfied with conventional religion but seeking something more substantial than spiritualist spectacle. 6. Modern selfhood and the hunger for synthesis. Beneath all these conditions lies a deeper transformation, the changing nature of modern selfhood. In earlier periods, identity was often stabilized by inherited community structures: church, village, family, and fixed social roles. Modernity weakened some of those structures and intensified others: nation-state, bureaucracy, industrial labor. Individuals increasingly experience themselves as self-making beings who must choose their meaning rather than simply inherit it. This shift produced both freedom and anxiety. When people are required to construct their own worldview, they can feel unmoored. Theosophy responded to this condition by offering a synthesis, a grand narrative that could hold many modern contradictions together. It promised that evolution had purpose, that diversity of religion concealed unity, that moral law governed the universe, that death was not annihilation, and that human beings could progress spiritually through disciplined effort. It also promised a kind of dignity. In a materialist universe, human beings can appear accidental and transient. In Theosophy's universe, human beings are participants in a vast moral and cosmic drama, and every action matters. This appeal should not be underestimated. It was not only about exotic doctrine. It was about restoring a sense of significance. 7. Why this background matters. This chapter's purpose has been to show that Theosophy was not an isolated oddity, but a plausible response to a specific historical environment. The movement drew from many currents: the crisis of Christian authority, the rise of scientific materialism, the popularity of spiritualism and mesmerism, the emergence of psychical research, the expansion of empire and translation, and the growing power of print networks and lecture circuits. Theosophy combined these elements into an ambitious project, a modern spiritual synthesis that claimed ancient origins and promised future progress. Chapter 2. New York, Spiritualism and the Founding Moment, 1870 to 1875. The Theosophical Society was not founded in a vacuum. Its birth in New York City in 1875 was the product of an urban spiritual culture that had already been fermenting for decades, an environment in which seances and lecture halls, newspapers and parlors, reform movements and speculative philosophies overlapped in unpredictable ways. New York, like London and Paris, was a modern metropolis in miniature, crowded, commercially aggressive, intellectually restless, and saturated with public debate. It was also a place where spiritual experimentation could flourish precisely because institutional authority was plural and contested. No single church, university, or learned society could fully dominate the public imagination. In such a setting, new movements could be invented, tested, ridiculed, and, if they proved compelling, organized. This chapter examines the immediate prehistory of the Society's founding, the American spiritualist milieu, the rise of a public culture of wonder and investigation, the personal networks that brought Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott together, and the conceptual ambitions that shaped the Society's earliest aims. The goal is not to mythologize the founding nor to treat it as a fraudulent trick, but to understand it as a historically intelligible response to the conditions described in the previous chapter. 1. The American spiritualist world and the culture of proof. By the 1870s, spiritualism in the United States had matured into a broad cultural field rather than a single movement. It encompassed committed believers, casual curiosity seekers, professional mediums, skeptical investigators, and outright performers who treated seances as theatrical events. Its appeal was partly emotional, comfort for the bereaved, but it was also intellectual. Spiritualists repeatedly insisted that their claims were not dogma, but evidence. If spirits could speak, knock, write, or produce physical manifestations, then immortality could be approached as a fact rather than a faith. This insistence on proof made spiritualism uniquely compatible with the modern scientific mood. Many participants framed seances as experiments and described themselves as investigators rather than devotees. In practice, the results were contested. Fraud was common, exposures were publicized, and the line between belief and entertainment was unstable. Yet the very instability kept the phenomenon alive. Every exposure suggested that some cases were fraudulent, not that all were. The debate itself became a cultural engine. New York provided an ideal stage for this environment. Newspapers reported on mediums and controversies, public lecturers drew crowds, and private salons hosted seances as social events. A person could participate in spiritualist culture without abandoning respectability, especially if they framed their interest as inquiry. This mattered for Theosophy. The Society would inherit spiritualism's appetite for evidence and its rhetoric of investigation, but it would also position itself as more disciplined, more philosophically serious, and, crucially, more systematic. 2. Reform, eclectic religion, and the American habit of association. The United States in the 19th century had a distinctive associational culture. Clubs, societies, lodges, reform organizations, and voluntary groups proliferated. This habit was partly democratic and partly practical. In a rapidly changing society, people built institutions to create stability, identity, and community. Religious innovation was often organized through such structures, from revivalist denominations to utopian communities. Spiritualism itself functioned through this associational mode. Circles formed in private homes, lecture series were organized, periodicals circulated, and conventions convened. Beyond spiritualism, the era hosted a wide range of alternative religious experiments: Swedenborgianism, transcendentalism, free religion movements, and various occult fraternities. The common pattern was eclecticism, the willingness to draw from multiple sources and to treat religious truth as something that could be tested in life rather than inherited as a closed creed. The Theosophical Society would adopt the American associational form: membership, officers, meetings, minutes, and public events, while claiming a far older philosophical lineage. This combination is central to its identity: modern in organization, ancient in claimed origin, democratic in outward structure, hierarchical in the inner logic of esoteric attainment. 3. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky: Persona, Controversy, and Cultural Timing. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky arrived in the American scene, already wrapped in a self-crafted aura. She presented herself as widely traveled, fluent in multiple traditions, and connected, directly or indirectly, to hidden sources of knowledge. Whether one reads this aura as genuine, exaggerated, or strategically performed, its social function is clear. In a culture fascinated by the exotic and the extraordinary, Blavatsky's persona was both marketable and provocative. She embodied the 19th century appetite for the mysterious East and the possibility that spiritual power might exist outside Christian institutions. Blavatsky's talent was not only in claiming unusual experience, but in synthesizing. She could connect disparate ideas: spiritualist phenomena, Hermetic motifs, Hindu and Buddhist vocabulary, evolutionary rhetoric, into a single narrative of hidden order. This capacity mattered because the spiritualist world was often conceptually thin. Seances produced excitement and controversy, but they did not necessarily produce a coherent worldview. Blavatsky offered what spiritualism frequently lacked: an explanatory system that claimed depth, antiquity, and moral law. Her critics would later argue that her system was built upon plagiarism, fabrication, or manipulative charisma. Her supporters would argue that she was a rare genius conveying truths poorly understood by conventional scholars. This manuscript does not require a definitive verdict at this point. Historically, what matters is that Blavatsky's persona and intellect fit the cultural timing. The 1870s were ripe for a figure who could provide a synthesis that felt both rational and enchanted. 4. Henry Steele Olcott: investigator, organizer, and public credibility. If Blavatsky supplied imaginative synthesis and charismatic authority, Henry Steele Olcott supplied organizational form and public legitimacy. Olcott had served in the Civil War and worked as a journalist. He was familiar with investigative methods and the public sphere. His involvement in spiritualism, particularly as an investigator of phenomena, placed him within the culture of proof that spiritualists valued, while his practical temperament made him suited to institution building. Olcott's significance for the founding moment is often underestimated. New movements rarely survive on charisma alone. They require structures that can outlast the founding personalities. Olcott contributed precisely that: administrative discipline, a sense of legal and organizational procedure, and a reformist ethos. He framed theosophy not as a private revelation, but as a society with aims, rules, and public responsibilities. The partnership between Blavatsky and Olcott, therefore, reflects a familiar pattern in modern religious innovation: the fusion of charismatic authority with bureaucratic stabilization. The tension between these poles would shape theosophy's later history, sometimes productively, sometimes destructively. 5. The Trigger: the Eddy brothers and the performance of the marvelous. A key episode in the immediate prehistory of the Society's founding involved the famous seances of the Eddy brothers in Vermont in 1874 to 1875. These events attracted wide attention and became a focal point for debates over the authenticity of spiritualist phenomena. Olcott attended as an investigator and wrote about what he observed. Blavatsky also appeared in this context, and their association formed within this charged atmosphere of wonder, controversy, and public fascination. The eddy phenomena functioned as a kind of crucible. For believers, they provided dramatic evidence. For skeptics, they provided a target for exposure. For Alcott and Blavatsky, they provided a setting in which the need for a more systematic interpretive framework could be felt. If phenomena were real or partly real, what did they mean? What forces produced them? How could one distinguish genuine phenomena from fraud, and how could one prevent the field from collapsing into spectacle? Theosophy's early self-presentation responded to these questions. It claimed to take phenomena seriously without being seduced by them, to insist on moral and philosophical depth rather than sensational entertainment. Whether it consistently achieved that aim is another matter, but the aim itself helps explain why the society could attract people disillusioned with spiritualism's theatrical excess while still fascinated by its possibilities. 6. A society is proposed, from private circle to public institution. The move from private interest to public institution was a decisive step. Theosophy's founders were operating in a culture where circles formed easily, but also dissolved easily. To found a society was to claim continuity and seriousness. It was to declare that the subject mattered enough to require collective effort, membership, and public aims. The founding of the Theosophical Society in 1875 was therefore an act of institutional imagination. It proposed that the spiritual crisis of modernity could be met not only by individual seeking, but by organized study and moral commitment. In its earliest formulations, the society was broadly oriented. It aimed to investigate unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in humanity, to promote comparative study, and to cultivate a fraternity that could transcend sectarian boundaries. These aims were deliberately flexible. They created a space in which spiritualists, freethinkers, seekers, and moral reformers could cooperate without agreeing on every metaphysical claim. This flexibility aided recruitment, but it also planted the seeds of future conflict. A movement broad enough to include many interpretations must eventually confront questions of identity. What is the society for, and what counts as legitimate teaching? 7. Early identity. Modern investigation or ancient wisdom. From the beginning, Theosophy balanced two identities that were not easily reconciled. One identity was modern and investigative, a society devoted to studying nature's hidden laws, approaching spiritual phenomena with a quasi-scientific seriousness, and rejecting blind faith. This identity made Theosophy attractive to educated people who wanted to remain modern and rational while exploring spiritual questions. The other identity was ancient and initiatory, the claim that the society was connected to a perennial wisdom religion preserved by advanced beings, and that true knowledge required inner development and disciplined training. This identity gave Theosophy depth, drama, and authority, but it also made it vulnerable to charges of fraud and to internal disputes over who possessed genuine esoteric legitimacy. The tension between these identities shaped the founding moment. It also explains why Theosophy could simultaneously appeal to skeptics, as investigation, and to believers, as revelation. The movement's early strength lay in its ability to speak in both registers, the language of modern inquiry and the language of ancient mystery. 8. The psychological appeal. Coherence, dignity, and moral law. Why would an educated 19th century person join such a society? The answer is not only curiosity. Theosophy offered a distinctive psychological and moral appeal. It promised coherence in a fractured intellectual world. It proposed that science, religion, and philosophy were not enemies, but partial views of a deeper order. It offered dignity to the seeker. One was not merely dabbling in superstition, but participating in a serious quest for truth. It offered moral law in a universe that materialism often rendered morally silent. Karma and reincarnation, presented as rational ethical principles rather than mere exotic beliefs, offered a way to interpret suffering, injustice, and personal responsibility within a meaningful narrative. This appeal helps explain why Theosophy could draw people who were dissatisfied with both orthodox religion and spiritualist spectacle. It was not simply more occult. It was, in its own self-understanding, more ethically demanding and more intellectually ambitious. The founding as an intelligible modern act. The founding of the Theosophical Society in 1875 was a modern act, an attempt to build an institution capable of addressing modernity's spiritual crisis without surrendering the prestige of rational inquiry. It arose from the American spiritualist milieu, the associational habits of 19th century civic life, and the intellectual hunger for synthesis. It was shaped by the particular partnership of Blavatsky's imaginative system building and Olcott's organizational discipline, and it was energized by the culture of contested evidence that surrounded spiritualist phenomena. Chapter 3. Building an Organization of Hidden Laws, Early Aims, First Texts and Public Identity, 1875 to 1879. The Theosophical Society's founding in New York in 1875 was only the beginning. What mattered historically was not the moment of declaration, but the struggle that followed. The effort to turn a loosely connected circle of seekers into a durable organization with a recognizable public identity. Movements of spiritual innovation rarely fail because their founders lack conviction. They fail because conviction alone cannot solve practical problems. Membership, money, leadership, credibility, internal disagreement, and the slow labor of producing shared meaning. The early years of the Theosophical Society were shaped by precisely these pressures. Its ambitions were grand, but its situation was precarious. It had to define itself for outsiders, discipline itself for insiders, and find a mode of operation that could survive the volatility of the spiritual marketplace. This chapter traces the Society's formative period from 1875 to 1879, the articulation of early aims, the development of its public language of investigation and universalism, the role of lectures and print culture, the production and impact of the first major text associated with the movement, and the forces that led the Society to relocate its center of gravity from New York to India. The argument is that Theosophy's early identity was forged through negotiation, between modern investigation and ancient wisdom, between openness and esotericism, between public respectability and sensational fascination, and between American cultural conditions and international ambition. 1. From declaration to structure, the problem of organizational survival. To found a society is to make a claim about continuity. It announces that the subject is not a passing interest, but a project worthy of collective effort. Yet continuity must be built. The early Theosophical Society had to do mundane work, drafting rules, defining membership, organizing meetings, appointing officers, producing minutes, and sustaining enthusiasm after the novelty faded. These tasks are easy to dismiss as bureaucratic, but in a new movement they are existential. Without structure, the Society would have remained another transient circle in a crowded field of 19th-century spiritual associations. This need for structure also created a new kind of authority. A society implies hierarchy, not necessarily rigid, but real. Officers are elected, decisions are made, priorities are set. Even a movement that claims to be open and non-dogmatic must decide what it will publish, who will speak for it, and how it will respond when disagreement arises. Early Theosophy, therefore, faced a paradox. It presented itself as a fraternity devoted to free inquiry, yet it required organizational decisions that inevitably shaped inquiry's boundaries. 2. Early aims, investigation, fraternity, and comparative ambition. In its early self-presentation, the Society framed itself in broad, adaptable terms. It emphasized 3 overlapping commitments. Investigation, a willingness to explore hidden laws of nature and the latent powers of humanity. This language appealed to those who admired science, but suspected that orthodox science was incomplete. It positioned Theosophy as modern rather than medieval, experimental rather than credulous. Fraternity, a commitment, at least rhetorically, to universal brotherhood beyond sectarian division. In an era of intense religious competition and social stratification, this ideal carried moral force and reformist resonance. Comparative study, an aspiration to learn from and synthesize religious and philosophical traditions across cultures. This was where Theosophy connected most directly with the 19th century's expanding scholarly and popular engagement with Asian religions, antiquity, and esoteric history. What is important is that these aims were not a closed creed. They were an umbrella under which diverse motivations could gather. A spiritualist could join to investigate phenomena, a reform-minded intellectual could join for the ethical ideal of brotherhood, an Orientalist-leaning seeker could join for comparative study and Eastern wisdom. An occultist could join for the promise of initiation and hidden powers. This breadth was a strategic strength in the short term and a structural weakness in the long term. It enabled early growth, but it ensured that the Society would eventually have to confront the question it initially postponed. What exactly is Theosophy? 3. The language of science and the Victorian prestige of investigation. Theosophy's early rhetoric deliberately borrowed the prestige of science without submitting fully to scientific constraints. The movement's leaders understood that 19th-century credibility was increasingly tied to investigative language, observation, experiment, law, method. Even religious discourse adopted scientific metaphors to appear modern. Theosophy's distinctive move was to claim that spiritual development itself could be a form of research. The laboratory was not only external, it was internal. Human consciousness, disciplined and refined, was presented as an instrument capable of perceiving realities beyond the range of ordinary senses. This claim allowed Theosophy to preserve the prestige of inquiry while avoiding the vulnerability of relying solely on external proofs. If a skeptic demanded laboratory demonstration, Theosophists could reply that the skeptic lacked the necessary training to perceive the relevant phenomena. This maneuver was effective rhetorically, but risky socially. It shifted authority towards those who claimed inner attainment. It also invited critics to accuse the movement of unfalsifiable claims, assertions immune to disproof because disbelief could always be reinterpreted as spiritual incapacity. The tension between openness and esoteric authority therefore appeared from the outset, even when the society presented itself as non-dogmatic. 4. Public lectures and the making of a theosophical audience. The early society operated within the lecture culture of the era. Public talks were central to civic education and entertainment, and they offered a way to recruit members beyond private circles. Lectures also allowed Theosophy to perform seriousness. A well-delivered address on comparative religion, occult philosophy, or the critique of materialism could attract educated listeners who might otherwise avoid séance culture. This lecture practice created an audience before it created a doctrine. People gathered around themes, spiritual meaning, hidden laws, Eastern wisdom, before they gathered around a formalized system. In many modern movements, doctrine emerges not as a blueprint, but as an outcome of communication. Arguments are refined because they must be repeated, questioned, defended, and made coherent for strangers. Lectures also contributed to the movement's early public identity as intellectual rather than merely phenomenal. Theosophy did not want to be seen as a carnival of wonders. It wanted to be seen as a philosophical response to modernity's crisis. Public speaking helped to stabilize that identity. 5. The first major text, Isis Unveiled and the Consolidation of a Worldview. The publication of Helena Blavatsky's Isis Unveiled in 1877 marked a decisive step. Whether one reads the text as brilliant synthesis, chaotic compilation, polemical performance, or some combination, its historical function is clear. It gave the movement a book that could circulate independently of live meetings and personalities. A society with a text becomes more than a social club. It becomes a school of thought. Isis Unveiled performed several tasks at once. It attacked materialism and orthodox theology. Blavatsky criticized the reduction of human life to physical processes and rejected the exclusivist claims of institutional Christianity. This polemical posture resonated with readers who felt constrained by church authority, yet dissatisfied with secular nihilism. It claimed continuity with ancient wisdom traditions. The text presented the idea that modern science and modern religion were partial and distorted reflections of a deeper perennial truth preserved in esoteric lineages. It elevated occult philosophy as a serious framework. Rather than treating phenomena as curiosities, it offered metaphysical explanations and linked them to moral law. It drew upon a wide range of sources: classical antiquity, Hermetic traditions, Eastern religions as known through translation, and contemporary debates about mesmerism and spiritualism. The book's style, dense, sweeping, confident, was itself part of its effect. It projected authority. It suggested that the author stood above conventional boundaries, able to connect disparate fields into a single narrative. For readers craving synthesis, this was intoxicating. For critics, it was evidence of confusion, plagiarism, or imposture. The key point is that Isis Unveiled helped shift Theosophy from an investigative posture to a more doctrinal posture. Even if the society claimed to be non-dogmatic, a major text inevitably functions as a center of gravity. Members began to rally around a shared vocabulary and set of claims. The movement's identity became more distinct, and therefore more vulnerable to critique. 6. Managing diversity. Spiritualists, occultists, freethinkers, and moral reformers. As the society became more visible, it had to manage internal diversity. Not all members wanted the same thing. Some were primarily interested in phenomena and psychical investigation. Others wanted moral philosophy and comparative religion. Some were drawn to esoteric initiation and the romance of secret masters. Others were skeptical of such claims and preferred to frame theosophy as a broad spiritual humanism. This diversity produced a recurring organizational problem: how to remain inclusive without becoming incoherent. The society's early aims were broad enough to accommodate many motivations, but as a shared worldview began to crystallize through texts and leadership, questions of legitimacy became sharper. The tension was not only intellectual, it was social. Who had influence? Who spoke? Whose interpretation became official in practice? In a movement that claimed universal brotherhood, authority still mattered, and authority was often tied to personality, charisma, and perceived access to hidden knowledge. 7. The turn towards India, international ambition and symbolic realignment. By the late 1870s, the Theosophical Society's trajectory began to shift decisively. The decision to relocate its headquarters to India in 1879 was not merely a change of address. It was a transformation of the society's symbolic identity. In America, Theosophy was one movement among many in a crowded spiritual marketplace. In India, it could position itself differently, not as an oddity, but as a movement claiming proximity to ancient wisdom at the very site where many Westerners imagined that wisdom to reside. India offered strategic advantages: a larger field of religious diversity, a colonial context in which debates over religion and reform were intensely active, and an opportunity for Theosophy to present itself as an ally of Asian traditions against missionary contempt. This move also signaled that Theosophy was not content to be an American phenomenon. It aspired to global relevance. The Society's leaders increasingly imagined their project as world historical, a revival of ancient wisdom in a modern age, with India as a spiritual center rather than a colonial periphery. Of course, this imagination was entangled with empire. The very idea of India as a reservoir of ancient wisdom was shaped by Western Romanticism and colonial knowledge. Theosophy could simultaneously challenge missionary arrogance and reproduce Orientalist projection. The relocation, therefore, did not remove the movement from modernity's contradictions. It placed those contradictions at the center of its identity. 8. Early credibility and the seeds of later controversy. The Society's early years also planted the seeds of the controversies that would later define it. The combination of investigative rhetoric and esoteric authority created a permanent vulnerability. If Theosophy claimed to investigate hidden laws, skeptics would ask for proof. If Theosophy claimed that proof required inner development, skeptics would accuse it of evasiveness. If Theosophy appealed to ancient wisdom, critics would demand evidence of lineage. If it invoked hidden masters, critics would treat the claim as either fraud or delusion. At the same time, supporters could interpret criticism as confirmation that the movement was challenging entrenched powers. In many modern spiritual movements, persecution narratives serve as cohesion mechanisms. External hostility becomes a sign of truth. Theosophy would later display this dynamic, especially during periods of public scandal. The early period, therefore, matters not only as a stage of growth, but as a stage of pattern formation. The ways the Society responded to internal diversity, the rhetoric it used to claim credibility, and the symbolic power it attached to India would all shape its later trajectory. Theosophy becomes a movement. Between 1875 and 1879, the Theosophical Society moved from founding gesture to movement identity. It built structures, articulated broad aims, cultivated public audiences through lectures, and consolidated a worldview through a major text. In doing so, it became more coherent and more influential, but also more contested. Its early strength lay in its ability to speak to modernity's crisis with a synthesis that felt both rational and enchanted. Its early vulnerability lay in the very same synthesis, which relied on claims that were difficult to verify and easy to ridicule. Chapter 4. India as Headquarters. Adyar, Empire and the Recasting of Theosophical Identity, 1879 to 1883. When the leaders of the Theosophical Society moved its headquarters from New York to India in 1879, they did more than change geography. They changed the Society's meaning. In the American context, Theosophy had been one movement among many within a crowded spiritual marketplace. Spiritualism, mesmerism, utopian experiments, eclectic churches, and fraternal orders all competed for attention. In India, by contrast, Theosophy could claim a different kind of legitimacy. It could present itself not as an exotic import, but as a return, an attempted reawakening of ancient wisdom at the imagined source of that wisdom. The relocation therefore functioned as a symbolic realignment. India became not merely the location of headquarters, but the spiritual axis around which the society's narrative of origins and authority could turn. This chapter examines the early Indian period from 1879 to 1883, the reasons for relocation, the establishment of the headquarters at Adyar near Madras, the society's engagements with Indian religious reform movements, its relationship to colonial structures and missionary critique, and the ways in which India operated simultaneously as lived reality and as Western spiritual imagination. The argument is that the move to India strengthened Theosophy's global influence while also intensifying its contradictions, binding it more tightly to the politics of empire and the ethics of cross-cultural interpretation. 1. Why India? Strategy, symbolism, and the limits of the American milieu. To understand the decision to relocate, one must begin with the constraints of the American scene. By the late 1870s, spiritualist culture in the United States was both widespread and unstable. It provided publicity and curiosity, but it was also saturated with fraud allegations and theatricality. For Blavatsky and Alcott, who increasingly wanted the Theosophical Society to be perceived as philosophically serious, spiritualism posed a reputational risk. Even sympathetic observers might assume that theosophy was merely another branch of seance culture. India offered an alternative positioning. The 19th century's Western fascination with Eastern wisdom had created a market for religious and philosophical ideas associated with India, Buddhism, and antiquity. At the same time, India was not merely a fantasy. It was a complex colonial society with active religious reform movements, print debates, and intellectual circles in which new alliances could be forged. For Alcott in particular, India also offered an arena for reformist work, education, moral uplift, and a symbolic resistance to missionary denigration of Asian religions. The move was therefore strategic. It allowed Theosophy to shed part of its American spiritualist image and to recast itself as a movement of global, and specifically Asian, spiritual authority. Yet the strategy came with costs. To operate in India was to operate within empire, with all the asymmetries and moral complications that entailed. 2. Arrival and first alliances, reform, curiosity, and the promise of respect. Blavatsky and Alcott's arrival in India was met with a mixture of curiosity, enthusiasm, skepticism, and political calculation. Indian reformers were not simply passive recipients of Western admiration. Many were engaged in urgent projects, defending religious traditions against missionary critique, modernizing practices in response to internal and external pressure, and building institutions capable of sustaining cultural identity under colonial rule. Theosophy's rhetoric of respect for Hindu and Buddhist thought, therefore, had immediate appeal. In a climate where missionary discourse often portrayed Indian religions as superstition or moral failure, Theosophists' public praise of Indian philosophy functioned as a counterweight. It offered Indian intellectuals a kind of international validation, a Western organization publicly asserting that Indian traditions contained profound metaphysical and ethical insight. This validation was politically useful, even when its terms were shaped by Western categories. Early alliances were also facilitated by print culture and lecture networks. Theosophy could present itself as a partner in reform and education, and the society's stated aim of universal brotherhood could be framed as moral solidarity across colonial boundaries. Yet it is vital to note that solidarity did not erase power. Theosophists were still foreigners, operating within colonial infrastructure, and their ability to move, publish, and gain attention was shaped by the privileges and constraints of their position. 3. Adyar, creating a center of gravity. The establishment of the headquarters at Adyar, near Madras, now Chennai, gave Theosophy a physical center that functioned as symbol and institution. Headquarters matter in new movements because they stabilize identity. They become sites of pilgrimage, archives of authority, and stages for performance. Adyar would become all of these. As a place, Adyar embodied Theosophy's ambition to be a global organization with a spiritual home. It also served as a point of administrative coordination for lodges and correspondence. Through Adyar, the society could imagine itself as a single transnational body rather than a loose collection of groups. But Adyar also became a theater of tension. The headquarters was a lived environment with staff, visitors, political relationships, and local dynamics. It was not a pure spiritual space. The daily reality of running an organization, money, disputes, personalities, domestic arrangements, inevitably collided with the movement's grand metaphysical claims. Theosophy's story repeatedly turns on this collision between lofty narrative and practical life, and Udyar became one of the most important sites where the collision was made visible. 4. Theosophy, Hindu reform, and the problem of authentic tradition. Theosophists in India often align themselves with Hindu reform movements and organizations that sought to defend and modernize Hindu identity. Such alliances were not simple endorsements. Reform movements themselves were diverse, ranging from more rationalist reinterpretations of Hinduism to more tradition-oriented revitalizations. Theosophy's relationship with these movements was shaped by its own agenda. It wanted to present Hindu philosophy as evidence of an ancient wisdom tradition that Theosophy claimed to revive. This produced a recurring problem, the question of authenticity. When Theosophists praised Hinduism, they often praised a particular version of it, philosophical, monistic, ethically elevated, compatible with modern progress. This version aligned strongly with certain reformist presentations, especially those that emphasized Vedantic philosophy. Yet it did not necessarily reflect the full diversity of lived Hindu practice across regions, castes, and communities. Theosophy's admiration, therefore, came with selection. It elevated some aspects and downplayed others. In doing so, it could inadvertently reinforce internal hierarchies, privileging elite philosophical traditions over popular devotional practices. It could also lend international prestige to reformist narratives that were themselves contested within India. For historians, the point is not to accuse Theosophy of deliberate manipulation, but to recognize that cross-cultural admiration is rarely neutral. It is shaped by what the admirer is seeking. Theosophy sought a philosophical anchor for its synthesis, and in India it often found that anchor in reinterpreted forms of Hindu thought compatible with its own aims. 5. Buddhism and the Ceylon, Sri Lankan dimension, education and public symbolism. Although this chapter's primary focus is India, Theosophy's early Asian work cannot be confined to Indian borders. Alcott's later involvement in Buddhist revival in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, illustrates how the society's Asian turn functioned across the region. Theosophy's defense of Buddhism against missionary critique, and its efforts in educational and organizational support became another way the movement positioned itself as an ally of Asian religions. This activity had symbolic power. It allowed Theosophists to claim that they were not merely studying Asian traditions, but actively supporting them. Yet it also raised questions about authority and agency. When Western organizers participate in Asian religious revival, their support can be enabling, but their presence can also distort power dynamics. The line between solidarity and self-centered protagonism is thin. Theosophy's record, like most cross-cultural reform alliances in the colonial era, shows both genuine commitment and structural ambivalence. 6. Empire shadow, missionaries, colonial officials, and public suspicion. The Theosophical Society's Indian presence placed it within a contested colonial public sphere. Missionaries often regarded Theosophy as dangerous. It undermined the narrative of Christian superiority and challenged conversion efforts by praising Hindu and Buddhist traditions as spiritually legitimate. Some colonial officials viewed the movement with suspicion as well, particularly when it aligned with Indian reformers and later with political activism. Theosophists, for their part, often positioned themselves as critics of missionary arrogance while avoiding explicit anti-colonial radicalism in the early years. Alcott's public rhetoric frequently emphasized moral reform and education rather than direct political confrontation. Yet even moral defense of colonized religions could have political implications. In a colonial context, to praise Hinduism publicly was to contest a hierarchy of civilization. This contestation shaped how Theosophists were perceived. They could be treated as allies by Indian reformers, as irritants by missionaries, and as eccentric outsiders by officials. Their position was unstable. It depended on social networks, public performances, and the careful management of controversy. 7. India as imagination, Orientalism, spiritual geography, and the romance of origins. India functioned for Theosophy not only as a place but as an idea. In Western spiritual imagination, India was frequently cast as ancient, mystical, timeless, the opposite of industrial modernity's perceived emptiness. Theosophy drew heavily upon this spiritual geography. It positioned India as a reservoir of wisdom that the West had lost. This imagination was not entirely invented. India did contain ancient religious traditions and philosophical systems with deep intellectual histories. But the Western romance of India often simplified complexity, turning living societies into symbolic landscapes. Theosophy participated in this simplification even as it resisted missionary contempt. It could portray India as a source of wisdom, while still framing that wisdom as hidden, esoteric, and guarded by secret adepts. This framing allowed Theosophy to claim proximity to India without fully submitting to the authority of existing Indian religious institutions. The true India in this narrative was not necessarily the India of ordinary practice. It was the India of masters, ancient texts, and timeless truths. The result is one of Theosophy's central contradictions. It could defend Asian religions publicly while also claiming a superior esoteric interpretation of them. It could honor India while also using India as a stage for a Western esoteric drama. 8. The making of international Theosophy, lodges, correspondence, and global reach. The Indian headquarters period also transformed the society's international reach. With Adyar as a center, the organization could coordinate lodges across different regions and communicate with members through an expanding network of correspondence and publications. The society began to resemble a genuinely transnational institution rather than a New York-based curiosity. This expansion mattered because it produced longevity. Movements survive when they develop infrastructure. Archives, procedures, training, and a sense of belonging that can persist even when individuals leave. Adyar served as administrative backbone and symbolic heart. But expansion also increased pressure for doctrinal clarity. As membership grew, members demanded teaching. As teaching circulated, disputes emerged. And as authority was claimed, whether through texts, charismatic leadership, or alleged master guidance, critics watched closely. The conditions for later crises were being built into the movement's success. A transformation with enduring consequences. Between 1879 and 1883, the Theosophical Society underwent a transformation that reshaped its entire history. Relocation to India strengthened its symbolic claim to ancient wisdom, expanded its international reach, and enabled alliances with reformist currents defending Hindu and Buddhist traditions. It also intensified the movement's entanglement with empire, sharpening ethical and political contradictions that would never fully disappear. Adyar became a center of gravity, but also a site where the tension between grand metaphysical narrative and practical organizational life became unavoidable. The movement's public identity shifted from American spiritualist experimentation to transnational spiritual authority rooted, at least in imagination, in India. That shift increased Theosophy's influence, but it also raised the stakes of credibility. Claims that might have been treated as curious in New York would be treated as scandalous, or politically charged, in the colonial public sphere. Chapter 5. Masters, Letters, and Credibility. The Mahatma Phenomenon and the Making of Authority, 1880 to 1884. By the early 1880s, the Theosophical Society had achieved something rare for a new spiritual movement. It had established an international footprint, founded a headquarters in India, and attracted allies among reform-minded intellectuals while remaining visible in European and American spiritual circles. Yet success created a new problem. The broader the audience, the sharper the demand for legitimacy. Theosophy claimed to be more than a social club or a philosophical salon. It claimed access to deeper laws of nature and to an ancient wisdom religion preserved by advanced beings. Such claims could not remain abstract for long. Members wanted reassurance that the movement's authority was real. Outsiders wanted evidence that it was not mere theater. The leadership therefore faced a strategic choice. Either build credibility through patient scholarship and moral service alone, or anchor credibility in more dramatic forms of proof. The Mahatma Phenomenon, the appearance of alleged communications from hidden masters, also called Mahatmas, became the movement's most powerful instrument of authority and its greatest liability. This chapter examines how the Mahatma narrative formed, why it was persuasive, how it functioned within the society, and why it provoked such intense controversy. The aim is not to adjudicate metaphysical truth claims, but to trace the social mechanics of spiritual authority, how charisma is institutionalized, how texts become tokens of legitimacy, and how credibility crises take shape when extraordinary claims enter the public record. 1. The need for authority. Why masters became central. Theosophy's early aims were broad: investigation, fraternity, comparative study, but breadth alone does not satisfy the hunger for certainty. Members did not only want an ethical ideal, they wanted guidance. They wanted to know whether Theosophy's synthesis rested on something firmer than personal opinion. In movements that challenge orthodox religion, the question of authority is unavoidable. If one rejects the church, what replaces it? If one doubts conventional theology, what legitimizes a new worldview? Theosophy's response was to claim lineage. The movement suggested that its teachings did not originate with a handful of 19th-century personalities, but were transmitted from an older source, a fraternity of adepts who had preserved spiritual knowledge across centuries. This claim had several advantages. It provided continuity with antiquity, it offered a narrative of discipline and initiation, and it positioned Theosophy as the public face of a hidden tradition rather than an invented novelty. In the colonial context, the idea of hidden masters also served a symbolic function. It allowed Theosophy to claim that spiritual authority existed outside Western institutions, outside churches, universities, and imperial administration. The masters were imagined as custodians of wisdom, superior to both missionary religion and materialist science. This imagination appealed to Western seekers disillusioned with their own culture's moral crises. It also appealed, in complex ways, to some Indian audiences who found the notion of advanced yogic adepts and esoteric lineages culturally intelligible, even when the particular theosophical framing was foreign. 2. What the Mahatma letters were: texts as tokens of legitimacy. The Mahatma letters were presented as communications from masters, most prominently figures referred to as Kuthumi, K.H., and Morya, M. These letters, allegedly produced through unusual means and sometimes arriving in dramatic circumstances, became more than private correspondence. They functioned as tokens of legitimacy, evidence that Theosophy's leadership was guided by advanced beings. In practical terms, the letters did several things at once. They confirmed membership expectations. They reassured believers that the movement was real in a stronger sense than philosophical plausibility. They disciplined internal disputes. If a letter seemed to endorse a particular person or decision, it could settle arguments by appeal to higher authority. They anchored doctrinal development. The letters contained teachings about karma, reincarnation, cosmology, ethics, and spiritual discipline that could be cited as authoritative. They created a narrative of proximity. Certain individuals were portrayed as closer to the masters, thereby forming an inner circle of legitimacy. It is difficult to overstate how socially potent such texts can be. In religious history, letters, revelations, prophetic utterances, and sacred documents often function not only as content but as social objects, things that establish hierarchy, identity, and belonging. The Mahatma letters served precisely this role. 3. A Victorian appetite for the extraordinary and the demand for proof. The Mahatma phenomenon emerged within a culture already fascinated by extraordinary communications. Spiritualism accustomed audiences to the idea that messages could arrive from invisible sources. Telegraphy, meanwhile, provided a modern metaphor for invisible transmission. The 19th century was saturated with new communications technology, and metaphors of transmission shaped spiritual imagination. If a message can travel invisibly through wires across oceans, why could it not travel through subtler forces across planes of existence? Such metaphors did not prove anything, but they helped make extraordinary claims feel less absurd. They provided a bridge between modern technological wonder and metaphysical possibility. At the same time, Victorian public culture was ruthless about exposure. The very appetite for marvels was accompanied by an appetite for debunking. A movement that produced dramatic evidence invited dramatic scrutiny. The Mahatma letters, therefore, placed Theosophy in a dangerous position. If the letters were accepted, the movement gained authority. If they were exposed as fraud, the movement's legitimacy could collapse, because the very device used to prove authenticity would become evidence of deception. 4. The inner circle: discipleship, hierarchy, and emotional investment. The Mahatma narrative also structured relationships inside the society. It created a model of discipleship. Some members were portrayed as probationers, cellists, or students under occult training. This did not necessarily require formal vows. It often functioned through implication and aspiration. To be recognized as spiritually advanced was to be closer to the masters, and proximity to the masters became a form of social capital. This structure had psychological power. It offered meaning to personal struggle. Difficulties could be interpreted as tests. It offered dignity to sacrifice. Service to the movement became service to a higher plan. It offered moral direction. One could interpret decisions as aligned with occult guidance rather than mere preference. Yet the same structure could generate manipulation, dependency, and conflict. If authority is tied to claims of hidden endorsement, then disagreement becomes dangerous. Criticism can be framed as spiritual failure. Ordinary organizational politics can be reframed as cosmic drama. Movements that rely on inner circles are therefore vulnerable to factionalism, because rival groups may claim competing forms of hidden legitimacy. Theosophy, in the early 1880s, displayed this vulnerability. Even without assuming bad faith, the social dynamics of esoteric authority created conditions in which trust could fracture easily. 5. A.P. Sinnett and the translation of esotericism into a public idiom. A crucial figure in the public shaping of the Mahatma phenomenon was Alfred Percy Sinnett, an Anglo-Indian journalist. Sinnett's role illustrates how Theosophy's authority moved from private claim to public narrative. Through his writings and connections, the masters were introduced to a wider English-speaking audience, not as vague occult rumors, but as characters in an intelligible story. Disciplined adepts guiding human evolution. Sinnett's significance also lies in his position within empire. As an Anglo-Indian, he inhabited the colonial world in which India was both lived reality and romanticized spiritual landscape. The masters, in this setting, could be imagined as hidden authorities native to the East, yet accessible to Western seekers through theosophical mediation. This is one of the places where Theosophy's colonial entanglement becomes clearest. It constructed a spiritual geography in which India was the site of superior wisdom, but the channels through which that wisdom was made legible to Western audiences were often shaped by Western intellectual and social frameworks. This dynamic increased Theosophy's reach. It also sharpened later critique. Critics could argue that the masters were a theatrical invention tailored to Western appetites for Eastern mystery, and that the movement's authority depended upon staging the East as a spiritual resource. 6. Phenomena, ethics, and the problem of moral authority. The Mahatma letters and related phenomena raised an ethical question that the society could not easily resolve. Is it morally acceptable to use extraordinary displays to secure belief? Theosophists often insisted that phenomena were secondary, and that true spiritual progress required ethical discipline. Yet the movement repeatedly relied on phenomena to validate itself. This contradiction produced internal anxiety. Some members feared that reliance on marvels would attract the wrong kind of follower, those seeking sensation rather than transformation. Others believed phenomena were necessary to break materialist skepticism and to demonstrate that hidden laws existed. This debate is not unique to Theosophy. Many movements oscillate between moral seriousness and spectacular proof. The spectacle draws attention and confirms belief, but it also undermines credibility and can distort motivation. Theosophy's particular challenge was that its moral claims, universal brotherhood, ethical evolution, required a high standard of integrity, while its spectacular claims exposed it to accusations of manipulation. 7. The accumulation of suspicion. What makes a credibility crisis? By 1884, the conditions for a credibility crisis were forming. Several factors contributed. Public visibility. As Theosophy grew, it attracted hostile scrutiny, particularly from missionaries and skeptics. Internal tension. Esoteric hierarchies produced jealousy and factionalism. Dependence on tokens. The more the movement relied on letters and phenomena as proof, the more vulnerable it became if those tokens were questioned. Colonial politics. In India, Theosophy's alliances and rhetoric could be interpreted politically, making it a target beyond purely religious dispute. A credibility crisis does not begin only when an accusation is made. It begins when a movement structure makes it vulnerable to accusation. The Mahatma phenomenon created precisely that vulnerability. It concentrated authority into claims that could be attacked, and it created a public expectation of evidence that the movement could not control. Authority gained, authority endangered. Between 1880 and 1884, the Theosophical Society's claim to hidden guidance became central to its identity. The masters and their letters provided a powerful narrative of lineage and legitimacy, helping to solidify the movement's internal cohesion and to attract educated supporters who wanted more than speculative philosophy. At the same time, this narrative exposed the society to scandal. Authority anchored in extraordinary tokens is always fragile, because it invites investigation under conditions the movement cannot dictate. Chapter 6. The Adyar Crisis. Accusations, the coulombs, and the mechanics of scandal, 1884. If the Mahatma phenomenon helped the Theosophical Society consolidate authority, it also created the conditions under which that authority could be shattered. By 1884, the society was not merely a curious organization of seekers. It was a visible transnational movement headquartered in colonial India, aligned with reform-minded allies, criticized by missionaries, and increasingly defined by extraordinary claims. In such a setting, scandal was not an accident, but a structural possibility. Movements that rely on contested evidence, letters that appear mysteriously, messages attributed to unseen masters, are highly vulnerable to a particular kind of attack, an insider's testimony that reinterprets wonders as tricks. The crisis that erupted at Udyar in 1884, centered on accusations made by Emma and Alexis Coulomb, became the most damaging episode in the Society's early history. It offered critics a narrative they could easily understand and publicize: hidden panels, secret compartments, staged phenomena, and an organization built on deception. Whether every charge was true, exaggerated, or fabricated is less important at this stage than the historical fact that the accusations landed with force and that they were believed by many. Scandal, once credible, acquires a momentum of its own. It becomes a social event, shaping reputations and institutions regardless of later qualifications. This chapter examines the Udyar crisis as a case study in the mechanics of scandal: how accusations arise, how they travel through print networks, why they persuade, and how they reshape organizational identity. The goal is not to offer a courtroom verdict, but to trace the crisis's dynamics and consequences within the Society's developing history. 1. The Coulombs, insiders at the edge of the movement. Emma and Alexis Coulomb were not distant observers. They were part of the daily life of Udyar, occupying a position that made them both useful and dangerous to the organization. In new movements, headquarters staff and close associates often possess a form of power that is easily overlooked. They see the private life behind the public myth. They witness practical arrangements, conflicts, personalities, and the mundane conditions under which spiritual work is carried out. This proximity can create loyalty, but it can also create resentment, especially when money is scarce, roles are ambiguous, and personal relationships are strained. By the time the crisis broke, the Coulombs had become disgruntled, and their testimony carried a particular kind of weight: the weight of the insider who claims to reveal what outsiders cannot see. Scandals often depend upon this figure. The insider is the one who can translate mystery into mechanism. The insider's story is persuasive not only because it offers details, but because it satisfies a cultural desire: the desire to explain wonders as tricks and to reduce spiritual authority to human deception. 2. The missionary press and the hunger for exposure. The Udyar crisis did not unfold in a neutral public sphere. Missionary criticism of theosophy had already been intense, and missionary publications were well positioned to amplify accusations. For missionaries who regarded Hindu and Buddhist traditions as error, theosophy's defense of these traditions was not merely a theological nuisance, it was a strategic obstacle. The movement's claim that Asian religions contained profound wisdom challenged missionary narratives of superiority and undermined conversion efforts. In that context, the Coulombs' accusations provided an ideal weapon. They did not require theological argument. They offered a more decisive form of attack: exposure. If theosophical phenomena could be shown as fraudulent, then the movement's moral and intellectual claims could be dismissed as a disguise for deception. Exposure narratives are powerful because they collapse complexity into a single moral judgment: fraud. The press environment of the era amplified this effect. Newspapers and magazines thrived on scandal, and allegations of deception were inherently newsworthy. Theosophy had already cultivated public fascination. Scandal was the predictable counterpart of fascination. 3. The shrine room and the theater of proof. A key focus of the Coulomb allegations involved the so-called shrine room at Udyar, associated with the reception of Mahatma letters and other extraordinary occurrences. The accusation was straightforward and vivid: that the room contained hidden devices, panels, compartments, or openings, through which letters could be delivered or phenomena staged. The power of such an allegation lies in its concreteness. The Mahatma letters were already contested, and skeptics had long suspected that mundane methods could explain their appearance. The shrine accusation offered a physical mechanism that readers could imagine. It turned an invisible mystery into a tangible contraption. In credibility conflicts, tangible mechanisms often defeat intangible claims. Theosophists could argue that hidden laws exist, that subtle forces operate, that masters communicate by means unknown to conventional science. Critics could reply with a diagram. A hidden panel is rhetorically devastating because it requires no metaphysical commitment to understand. It makes the extraordinary look ordinary. Whether the physical evidence conclusively proved fraud was, and remains, debated. But the scandal's historical significance lies in the public perception. Once people believed there was a mechanism, the burden of proof shifted heavily against theosophy. 4. The battle over documents, letters, authenticity, and narrative control. Another major element of the crisis involved contested documents. letters allegedly written by Blavatsky that suggested orchestration of phenomena. Such documents functioned as the scandal's smoking gun. In public controversies, a document has a unique power. It appears objective. It can be reproduced, quoted, circulated, and treated as self-evident. Theosophy, however, was a movement already shaped by the authority of letters. The Mahatma letters had served as tokens of legitimacy. Now letters were used as tokens of fraud. This symmetry is important. When a movement builds authority through textual tokens, it risks being destroyed by textual tokens. The very medium that created legitimacy becomes the medium through which legitimacy is attacked. The dispute, therefore, became a battle not only over events but over narrative control. Theosophists contested the authenticity of the incriminating letters, argued they were forged or manipulated, and insisted that the allegations were motivated by resentment and hostility. Critics insisted that the letters revealed deception and that theosophical defenders were rationalizing. In such situations, truth becomes difficult to stabilize publicly. Most readers cannot verify authenticity themselves. They rely on trust in the accuser, trust in the accused, trust in the publication that prints the documents. The crisis therefore exposed a deeper vulnerability. Theosophy demanded trust in hidden masters, but scandal demanded trust in visible evidence. Competing trust economies collided. 5. Why scandals spread. Moral clarity and the pleasure of unmasking. The rapid spread of the Adyar scandal illustrates an enduring feature of modern public life. Scandals spread because they offer moral clarity. They turn ambiguity into judgment. They invite the audience to feel superior to the deceived. They provide the pleasure of unmasking. Theosophy had presented itself as a movement of hidden truth and higher knowledge. Exposure narratives are particularly potent against such movements because they invert the hierarchy. The self-proclaimed enlightened become the fooled. The mysterious masters become stage props. The seekers become dupes. The audience, reading the scandal, gains the satisfaction of seeing through illusion. This does not mean the audience is always correct. It means that scandal satisfies psychological and cultural needs. In Victorian credibility culture, exposure was not only moral but modern. It aligned with ideals of rationality and skepticism. To unmask occult fraud was to defend reason against superstition, civilization against primitive credulity. The Adyar crisis therefore resonated with broader modern narratives about progress and enlightenment, even as theosophy itself claimed to represent a higher synthesis beyond crude materialism. 6. The internal damage, trust, faction, and organizational trauma. Scandal does not only injure public reputation, it fractures internal trust. Within the society, the Adyar crisis intensified existing tensions. Members who had doubted phenomena felt confirmed. Members who had believed felt betrayed, defensive, or traumatized. Leadership had to manage not only external attack but internal morale. In movements built partly on charismatic authority, scandal threatens the glue that holds people together. It forces members to decide whether loyalty matters more than evidence, whether doubt is a virtue or a betrayal, whether criticism is honest inquiry or hostile sabotage. Such decisions rarely remained purely intellectual. They become emotional, tied to identity and belonging. The Adyar crisis, therefore, accelerated a process of hardening. The movement's boundaries became more defined. Some members left. Others became more committed, interpreting the scandal as persecution and proof that the society threatened powerful interests. This dynamic, hostility producing cohesion among loyalists, is common in controversial movements. It can strengthen a core group even as it shrinks the movement's broader appeal. 7. The question of motive, resentment, ideology, and political context. A scandal is never only about what happened. It is also about why people believe it happened. Motive narratives become central. The Coulombs were disgruntled employees. Missionaries were ideologically hostile. Theosophists were self-deceived or manipulative. Reformers were politically invested in Theosophy's alliance. These motive narratives matter because they shape credibility. If an accuser is seen as resentful, their testimony can be discounted. If a critic is seen as ideologically hostile, their investigation can be dismissed as biased. Theosophists would later emphasize missionary hostility as a framework for interpreting the scandal. The movement was attacked because it defended Asian traditions and challenged Christian supremacy. Critics would emphasize the practical motives of insiders and the plausibility of staged phenomena. In colonial India, these motive narratives were layered with politics. Theosophy's presence touched sensitive points: religion under empire, the contest for cultural authority, and the moral legitimacy of colonial structures. Scandal therefore operated not only as personal drama, but as a struggle over public legitimacy in a highly charged environment. 8. The immediate outcome. From scandal to investigation. By late 1884, the Adyar crisis had escalated beyond private dispute. It had become a public controversy with international implications. The Society's claims were now under formal scrutiny. The stage was set for the involvement of organized investigators, most famously the Society for Psychical Research, whose interventions would shape Theosophy's reputation for decades. The movement's leadership faced a dilemma. If it dismissed the scandal entirely, it risked appearing evasive. If it engaged with investigators, it risked granting legitimacy to hostile scrutiny and exposing itself to methods it could not control. Either way, the crisis could not be contained within internal discipline. It had entered the public record. The cost of spectacular legitimacy. The Adyar crisis of 1884 was a turning point because it attacked Theosophy at its most vulnerable point, the use of extraordinary phenomena as tokens of authority. The movement had gained credibility among believers by presenting evidence of hidden masters. Now it faced the possibility of losing credibility among the wider public through allegations that the evidence had been staged. Whether one ultimately judges the accusations as conclusive, exaggerated, or motivated, their historical effect is undeniable. They reshaped public perception, hardened internal divisions, and forced the Society into a defensive posture. Theosophy would not recover its early innocence after 1884. It would become a movement defined not only by its ambitious synthesis, but by its contested credibility. Chapter 7. The Hodgson Report and the Afterlife of Judgment. Psychical Research Meets Theosophy, 1885. By 1885, the controversy that began at Adyar had escalated into something more enduring than scandal. It had become a verdict, one issued not only by missionaries and hostile journalists, but by an organization that claimed to speak in the name of disciplined inquiry. When the Society for Psychical Research, SPR, produced the report written by Richard Hodgson, it did more than assess evidence. It fixed a narrative. The report's conclusions would echo through newspapers, encyclopedias, and skeptical histories for generations, shaping popular memory of Theosophy long after the original disputes had faded. This chapter examines the Hodgson Report as both document and event. Why the SPR investigated, how Hodgson framed his inquiry, what kinds of evidence were considered persuasive, and why the report's impact exceeded its immediate findings. It also examines the report's afterlife, how later reassessments complicated its authority, and why, despite those complications, the Hodgson verdict continue to function as a cultural shorthand for Theosophy's credibility problems. The aim is not to relitigate every detail, but to understand a broader historical question. What happens when modern institutions of investigation claim the right to judge spiritual movements? 1. The Society for Psychical Research, Credibility Through Method. The SPR was founded in 1882 in a climate where extraordinary claims were widespread and contested. Spiritualism had drawn many educated participants, but fraud was common enough to make belief socially risky. The SPR sought to create a new middle position between credulity and contempt, a disciplined investigation of phenomena that conventional science dismissed or ignored. This ambition mattered because it offered a public instrument for managing uncertainty. The late 19th century was filled with claims that hovered at the edge of the knowable: telepathy, apparitions, mediumistic communications, mesmerist effects. Some of these claims could be explained psychologically, some could be exposed as trickery, and some remained ambiguous. The SPR presented itself as an organization capable of separating the genuine from the fraudulent using careful observation, documentation, and skeptical discipline. In principle, this position was compatible with Theosophy's early rhetoric of investigation. The Society had claimed to explore hidden laws and to take extraordinary phenomena seriously without descending into superstition. Yet in practice, Theosophy's method claims differed sharply. Theosophists argued that the most important evidence was not always externally testable and that inner development was required to perceive subtle realities. The SPR, by contrast, was oriented towards external verification and the credibility standards of the educated public. These different epistemologies, different theories of what counts as knowledge, were bound to collide. 2. Why Theosophy became a target: visibility, provocation, and the economy of proof. Theosophy attracted SPR attention for several reasons. First, it was highly visible. A movement that claimed contact with hidden masters, produced dramatic letters, and operated headquarters in colonial India, was inherently newsworthy. Second, it provoked conflict. Missionary hostility, Adyar scandal, and internal rumors created the impression that theosophy was a credibility problem demanding resolution. Third, the movement relied on specific, contestable tokens of proof, letters, phenomena, shrine events, that could be investigated in ways spiritual synthesis could not. In other words, theosophy was not investigated simply because it was strange. It was investigated because it made claims that seemed to invite method. If a letter appeared in an unlikely place, one could ask how it got there. If a hidden panel existed, one could inspect it. If a person claimed to mediate messages from invisible masters, one could examine handwriting, testimony, and material conditions. This is a crucial point about modern investigation. Investigators are drawn to phenomena that are legible within their method. Theosophy's metaphysics might be too broad for empirical adjudication, but its tokens of authority were not. The movement, in building credibility through dramatic signs, created precisely the kind of evidence that could be reinterpreted as fraud. 3. Hodgson's approach. Constructing a case rather than observing a world. Richard Hodgson approached theosophy as a problem to be solved. This framing shaped the inquiry's tone and outcome. Investigations are never purely neutral. They are structured by questions, assumptions, and expectations. If one begins with the assumption that fraud is likely, evidence will be gathered and interpreted differently than if one begins with the assumption of ambiguity. Hodgson's report is notable for its comprehensive ambition. It sought not merely to evaluate particular incidents but to explain the entire Mahatma phenomenon as a system of deception. It examined physical arrangements at Adyar, assessed testimony, analyzed handwriting, and considered the disputed Coulomb letters. It also attempted to map the social structure of belief. Who claimed what, who believed whom, and what motivations might explain the pattern. This case-building approach had rhetorical force. Rather than leaving uncertainty in place, it offered a coherent narrative. Phenomena were staged. Letters were manufactured. Blavatsky was the central agent of deception, and the masters were fictional constructs used to legitimize the movement. In public controversies, coherence often wins. A tidy explanatory story, especially one that aligns with common skeptical intuition, can be more persuasive than a complex mixture of partial evidence and unresolved ambiguity. 4. The report's conclusions, judgment as cultural power. The Hodgson report concluded, in essence, that the Mahatma phenomena were fraudulent and that Blavatsky was implicated as a principal architect of deception. The specific details and arguments were extensive, but what mattered culturally was the overall verdict. Theosophy's extraordinary claims were not mysterious truths. They were manufactured proofs. This verdict had disproportionate impact because it came from an institution that claimed scientific seriousness. Even readers unfamiliar with the report's details could rely on the authority of the SPR label. Investigated and exposed is a powerful phrase in modern public life. It converts debate into closure. The report therefore functioned not only as an analysis but as a moral judgment. It implied not simply that phenomena were explainable by mundane means, but that theosophy's leadership was deceitful. In a movement that emphasized ethics and brotherhood, this implication was devastating. It attacked the moral foundation of authority, not only the technical explanation of events. 5. Theosophical response, persecution narrative and institutional resilience. Theosophists contested the report vigorously. They argued the Hodgson relied too heavily on hostile testimony, misunderstood cultural context, and approached the inquiry with prejudice. They insisted that the masters were real and that phenomena were genuine, even if particular incidents had been misrepresented or exploited by enemies. Many framed the investigation as part of a broader ideological struggle. Theosophy was being attacked because it challenged missionary dominance and materialist arrogance. This response illustrates a common dynamic in controversial movements. External judgment can strengthen internal cohesion. When believers interpret hostility as persecution, they become less likely to accept evidence against the movement. Doubt becomes betrayal, and loyalty becomes proof of spiritual maturity. Theosophy's internal culture, already shaped by esoteric hierarchy and the romance of hidden guidance, was fertile ground for this dynamic. At the same time, the society proved institutionally resilient. It did not dissolve under the report's blow. It adapted. It shifted emphasis away from spectacular phenomena and towards doctrinal synthesis and ethical practice. It developed more structured internal teaching environments and relied increasingly on published texts rather than staged marvels. In this sense, the Hodgson Report forced Theosophy to evolve organizationally, even as it damaged its public reputation. 6. The Afterlife. Why the Hodgson Verdict endured. The most striking feature of the Hodgson Report is not only that it was influential in 1885, but that it remained influential long after its immediate context was forgotten. Several factors explain this endurance. It offered narrative closure. People prefer resolution to ambiguity. The report allowed skeptics to dismiss Theosophy without engaging its ideas. It fitted modern progress stories. The exposure of occult fraud aligned with a cultural narrative in which rational investigation triumphs over superstition. It became a citation shortcut. Later writers could invoke the Hodgson Report as an authority without reading it, turning it into a symbolic reference rather than a study document. It shaped encyclopedic memory. Once a movement is labeled fraudulent in reference works and popular histories, the label becomes self-reinforcing. In other words, the report became a cultural artifact, a tool for categorizing Theosophy within modern credibility hierarchies. It functioned as an answer to a question many people did not want to revisit. Is Theosophy real? The report provided a ready-made response. 7. Reassessment and complication. The problem of final verdicts. No investigative document, however authoritative, is immune to later reassessment. Over time, scholars and commentators revisited the Hodgson Report's methods and conclusions, arguing that it contained serious flaws and that Hodgson's handling of evidence was in places tendentious. Such reassessments did not necessarily prove theosophical claims true, but they challenged the certainty of the original verdict. This is historically significant for a broader reason. Modern culture often treats investigative reports as final judgments, yet investigations are shaped by their time's assumptions and institutional pressures. The SPR was a product of Victorian credibility culture. It had its own reputational interests. It was also operating in a colonial context where testimony and authority were entangled with ideology. Later reassessments remind us that method does not guarantee neutrality and that institutional judgment can become part of the story it seeks to evaluate. The historian's responsibility is therefore twofold: to acknowledge the report's enormous impact and to resist treating it as the final word. The Hodgson Report is part of Theosophy's history, not the end of it. 8. The deeper question. What counts as evidence in modern spiritual life? The clash between the SPR and Theosophy reveals a deeper issue that reaches beyond this particular movement. Modernity does not eliminate spiritual longing. It reorganizes it around questions of evidence and authority. When spiritual movements claim extraordinary phenomena, they enter the modern arena of verification, exposure, and institutional judgment. Yet spiritual experience often resists the forms of proof modern institutions prefer. This creates a permanent tension. The desire for evidence meets the limits of evidentiary method. Theosophy attempted to bridge this tension by presenting itself as both spiritual and scientific. The SPR attempted to manage the tension by expanding inquiry to contested phenomena while maintaining skeptical discipline. Their encounter produced not reconciliation, but conflict, because they disagreed about the very nature of knowing. For Theosophists, inner development was a condition of perception. For Hodgson, inner conviction was a potential source of delusion. This tension continues in modern spiritual culture. Theosophy's 19th-century credibility crisis, therefore, remains instructive not only as historical drama, but as a case study in how modern societies negotiate the boundaries of legitimate knowledge. Judgment issued, movement transformed. The Hodgson Report was a turning point because it transformed controversy into judgment. It supplied a narrative that satisfied the public appetite for exposure and aligned with modern ideals of rational progress. Its influence endured because it provided closure, became a citation shortcut, and entered popular memory as definitive. Yet Theosophy did not end in 1885. It adapted. It shifted emphasis towards doctrine and ethics, recalibrated its public posture, and continued to grow in various forms. In doing so, it demonstrated a paradox common in modern spiritual movements. The very crises that threaten legitimacy can also force organizational evolution. Theosophy's later history, its schisms, its doctrinal developments, its cultural diffusion, cannot be understood without recognizing that the Hodgson verdict did not settle the movement's fate. It reshaped the conditions under which the movement would go on. Chapter 8. Doctrine after Scandal. The Secret Doctrine, Esoteric Sections, and the Reconstruction of Authority, 1886 to 1891. After the Adyar Crisis and the publication of the Hodgson Report, the Theosophical Society faced a stark reality. Its reliance on spectacular phenomena as tokens of legitimacy had become a liability. Public confidence had been shaken, critics were emboldened, and the movement's moral credibility was under scrutiny. Yet Theosophy did not dissolve. Instead, it reoriented. In the years following 1885, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and her closest collaborators undertook a deliberate reconstruction of authority, shifting emphasis away from public marvels and towards a systematized esoteric doctrine. The publication of The Secret Doctrine in 1888 marked the culmination of this shift. Combined with the formation of more structured inner teaching circles, particularly the esoteric section, later the esoteric school, it signaled a transformation in Theosophy's self-understanding. The movement would henceforth present itself less as a society proving occult phenomena and more as a philosophical school transmitting a comprehensive cosmology. This chapter examines that reconstruction, why it was necessary, how it was framed, what the secret doctrine attempted to accomplish, and how the creation of inner structures reshaped the society's authority and internal culture. 1. Retreat or evolution. Reframing the movement center of gravity. Theosophy's post-1885 turn was not merely defensive, though it was partly that. It was also consistent with impulses that had existed from the beginning. Even in its earliest years, Blavatsky had insisted that phenomena were secondary to philosophy and ethics. The scandal, however, forced that insistence into practice. If phenomena could be exposed or reinterpreted as fraud, they were too fragile to sustain authority. The movement therefore leaned into what it could defend more securely: doctrine. Philosophy cannot be disproved in the same way a hidden panel can be exposed. A cosmological system may be criticized, but it is not vulnerable to physical inspection. By foregrounding metaphysics and moral teaching, Theosophy could shift the battleground from mechanics to meaning. This shift also altered the type of member the society attracted. Spectacle draws the curious, doctrine draws the committed. The post-scandal movement increasingly appealed to those willing to study dense texts, engage with complex symbolic systems, and accept a demanding cosmology that required intellectual and moral discipline. 2. The Secret Doctrine. Ambition on a grand scale. Published in 1888, The Secret Doctrine was vast in scope and audacious in tone. It presented itself as a commentary on ancient stanzas from a hidden source, the Book of Zion, and as a synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy. Its ambition was nothing less than to provide a cosmology capable of integrating evolutionary theory, ancient myth, occult anthropology, and moral law into a single, coherent narrative. The text attempted several major tasks. Cosmogenesis, an account of the origin and evolution of the cosmos through cycles, emanations, and stages of manifestation. Anthropogenesis, a theory of human origins involving root races, spiritual evolution, and complex stages of development. Comparative synthesis, an argument that ancient myths and religious traditions encoded fragments of a universal wisdom tradition. Critique of materialism, a sustained challenge to reductionist science and dogmatic theology alike. The book's style mirrored its ambition. It was dense, referential, polemical, and confident. It cited a wide array of sources, scientific, classical, religious, and wove them into a single narrative of hidden unity. For sympathetic readers, this breadth signaled mastery. For critics, it suggested overreach and intellectual bricolage. Historically, what matters is that The Secret Doctrine repositioned Theosophy as a serious cosmological project. It offered members a system to study and defend, shifting attention from contested phenomena to speculative metaphysics. Whether or not readers accepted its claims, they could not dismiss it as mere seance culture. 3. Evolution spiritualized, appropriating and contesting Darwin. One of The Secret Doctrine's most significant features was its engagement with evolutionary theory. By the late 19th century, Darwinian evolution had reshaped biological understanding and unsettled theological certainty. Theosophy did not reject evolution. It reinterpreted it. Biological change was reframed as the outward sign of a deeper spiritual process. Humanity was not merely an accidental product of natural selection, but a participant in a long arc of spiritual unfolding. This move accomplished two things. First, it allowed Theosophy to present itself as modern rather than reactionary. It did not deny scientific discovery, it claimed to extend it. Second, it infused evolution with moral meaning. Instead of a blind process, evolution became a journey towards consciousness and ethical refinement. Yet this synthesis carried complications. Theosophical anthropogenesis included speculative ideas about root races and stages of human development that reflected 19th-century intellectual currents, including problematic racial theories common in that era. While some theosophists interpreted these ideas symbolically or spiritually, the language was embedded in a historical context saturated with hierarchical thinking. The movement's attempt to spiritualize evolution therefore illustrates both its creative ambition and its entanglement with the conceptual limits of its time. 4. The esoteric section. Inner discipline and the management of authority. Alongside doctrinal consolidation came structural consolidation. In 1888, Blavatsky established the esoteric section, yes, an inner body within the society dedicated to more intensive spiritual training. This development addressed a long-standing tension. If theosophy claimed that deeper knowledge required discipline and moral purification, how could that be cultivated in an open membership organization? The esoteric section created graded belonging. Outer membership remained broadly accessible, centered on study and fellowship. Inner membership required commitment, confidentiality, and ethical discipline. This structure resembled traditional initiatory models. Outer teachings for the many, inner instruction for the few. From an organizational perspective, the YES achieved several aims. It stabilized authority by creating a formal channel for advanced teaching. It reduced reliance on public phenomena as proof of occult contact. It intensified loyalty among committed members, who now saw themselves as participants in a serious spiritual path rather than casual sympathizers. It provided continuity beyond Blavatsky's public persona, embedding authority in structured practice rather than in spontaneous marvels. At the same time, the creation of an inner section reinforced hierarchy. Access to deeper teaching depended on acceptance by leadership. Authority became less spectacular, but more concentrated. This change would shape later succession disputes, as questions arose over who legitimately inherited inner authority after Blavatsky's death. 5. Ethics over phenomena. Reconstructing moral credibility. The post-scandal period placed renewed emphasis on ethics. Universal brotherhood, altruism, and self-transformation were foreground. The message was clear. Theosophy was not about tricks or hidden compartments. It was about the moral evolution of humanity. This emphasis was both principled and strategic. Ethically serious movements are harder to dismiss as charlatanism, even if their metaphysics remain contested. By framing itself as a school of character rather than a theater of marvels, Theosophy sought to rebuild trust. Yet rebuilding moral credibility is complex. Critics could still point to the earlier scandal as evidence of deception. Theosophists therefore had to integrate the crisis into their narrative. Some portrayed it as a test of faith. Others treated it as a misunderstanding amplified by hostile forces. In either case, the movement's identity became partly defined by survival through persecution, a motif that would recur in later decades. 6. London years and intellectual consolidation. Blavatsky's later years in London further reinforced the doctrinal turn. London, as a center of empire and intellectual exchange, offered a different audience than Adyar. Here, Theosophy engaged with artists, intellectuals, and seekers interested less in colonial reform and more in philosophical and aesthetic experimentation. Study groups formed around the secret doctrine. Public lectures continued, but the tone was often more reflective and less sensational than in the earlier American period. The movement increasingly resembled a serious esoteric school rather than a frontier experiment in spiritualism. This London consolidation also laid groundwork for the Society's later influence in art, literature, and early modernist culture. Theosophy's cosmology, symbolic language, and interest in hidden correspondences resonated with creative circles dissatisfied with materialism but wary of orthodoxy. 7. Blavatsky's final authority and the problem of succession. Blavatsky's death in 1891 presented a new challenge. During her lifetime, even amid controversy, she had been the central figure, the source of doctrine, charisma, and connection to the masters. With her passing, the question of succession became unavoidable. The existence of the esoteric section complicated matters. Authority was now structured, but still deeply personal. Who had been closest to the inner teaching? Who could legitimately interpret the master's will? Who controlled institutional levers? The seeds of later schisms were already present. The reconstruction of authority after scandal had stabilized doctrine and discipline, but it had also concentrated interpretive power in ways that made future disputes almost inevitable. In movements where authority is both institutional and esoteric, succession is rarely smooth. 8. From wonder culture to philosophical school. The period from 1886 to 1891 marks a decisive shift in Theosophy's identity. The movement that had once relied heavily on phenomena as proof now foreground metaphysical system and ethical discipline. It did not abandon belief in masters or hidden laws, but it embedded those beliefs within a dense doctrinal framework less vulnerable to mechanical exposure. This transformation did not erase controversy. Critics continued to cite the Hodgson Report. Skeptics continued to question cosmological claims. But the movement's center of gravity had moved. It was no longer primarily about proving marvels. It was about offering a grand interpretive narrative for modernity. Authority rebuilt, tensions preserved. In the wake of scandal, Theosophy chose reconstruction rather than retreat. Through the secret doctrine, the formation of the esoteric section, and renewed emphasis on ethical evolution, it repositioned itself as a disciplined school of esoteric philosophy. This shift strengthened internal cohesion and broadened its intellectual appeal, especially in Britain and Europe. Yet reconstruction did not resolve underlying tensions. Questions of authority, hierarchy, and succession remained. The movement's engagement with evolutionary and racial theories reflected both creative synthesis and the limitations of its era. Its claim to ancient lineage still depended on contested narratives of hidden masters. Chapter 9. Schism and Succession. Leadership Struggles and the Fragmentation of Theosophy, 1891 to 1898. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky's death in 1891 did not end the Theosophical Society, but it removed the single figure who had embodied its doctrinal authority, charismatic legitimacy, and symbolic connection to the masters. In movements that rely on both institutional structure and esoteric lineage, succession is rarely straightforward. Authority must be transferred, but it is never merely procedural. It is interpretive. It requires deciding who best represents the founder's vision, who holds authentic inner knowledge, and who can command loyalty across continents. The years following 1891 were marked not by collapse, but by fragmentation. Competing centers of authority emerged. Personal loyalties hardened into factions. Doctrinal nuance became organizational boundary. By the end of the decade, the movement had split formally, creating parallel theosophical organizations that claimed continuity with the original society. The schism was not simply a matter of personality conflict. It revealed deep tensions within Theosophy's structure, between esoteric authority and democratic governance, between doctrinal development and fidelity to the founder, and between national contexts that shaped different priorities. This chapter traces the period from Blavatsky's death through the formal split of 1895 and its aftermath, focusing on three central figures: Henry Steele Olcott, Annie Besant, and William Quan Judge. It examines how their differing visions and claims to legitimacy reshaped the movement, and how schism paradoxically contributed to Theosophy's endurance. 1. The problem of succession. Charisma without the charismatic. Max Weber's famous distinction between charismatic authority and institutional authority is helpful here, though Theosophy complicates it. Blavatsky's authority was partly charismatic, rooted in her persona, intellectual daring, and alleged contact with masters. But it was also textual and structural. The secret doctrine and the esoteric section had begun the process of routinizing charisma, embedding it in doctrine and inner discipline. When Blavatsky died, that routinization was incomplete. The movement had a president, Olcott, responsible for organizational continuity, an esoteric section with its own inner structures, a growing international network of lodges, a body of complex doctrine open to interpretation. What it did not have was an uncontested interpreter of Blavatsky's legacy, who spoke for the masters now, who defined orthodoxy. Was authority administrative, esoteric, textual, or personal? These questions would not remain theoretical for long. 2. Olcott, institutional continuity and cautious leadership. Henry Steele Olcott remained president of the society after Blavatsky's death. His authority rested on continuity and administrative legitimacy. He had been co-founder, organizer, and public defender of the movement. He was widely respected for his dedication and reform work, particularly in South Asia. Yet Olcott was not Blavatsky. He did not claim the same depth of esoteric insight or visionary authorship. His style was pragmatic rather than revelatory. As a result, while he provided stability, he did not resolve the deeper question of spiritual succession. Alcott's priority was unity. He wanted the society to remain a single international body centered at Udyar. This required managing strong personalities and balancing regional interests, especially those in the United States and Britain, where influential leaders were emerging with their own followings. Unity, however, would prove difficult to sustain. 3. William Quan Judge, American Authority and Contested Communications. William Quan Judge, co-founder and leading figure in the American section, represented a different axis of authority. He had long been associated with Blavatsky's inner circle and was widely regarded by his supporters as spiritually advanced. In the years following her death, Judge became the focus of controversy regarding alleged communications from the masters. The issue echoed earlier patterns. Just as Mahatma letters had once served as tokens of legitimacy, claims of continued master guidance became a basis for Judge's authority. Supporters saw this as continuity with Blavatsky's mission. Critics saw it as a dangerous repetition of the very mechanisms that had produced scandal in the 1880s. The conflict was not only about whether communications were genuine, it was about governance. If Judge could claim direct occult endorsement, his authority might supersede administrative structures. Alcott and others worried about the implications. Could the society function if rival leaders invoked invisible sanction to justify their actions? Accusations were raised that Judge had misrepresented or fabricated messages. Investigations were initiated. The language of credibility, so devastating in the Hodgson era, re-emerged within the movement itself. 4. Annie Besant. Intellect, reform, and expanding influence. Annie Besant's entrance into Theosophical leadership added further complexity. A former secularist and social reformer, Besant brought formidable rhetorical skill, organizational energy, and public presence. She was intellectually capable of articulating Theosophy's doctrines in accessible language and was deeply committed to its ethical ideals. Besant's alignment initially leaned towards Judge in certain disputes, but her long-term role would become central to the Adyar branch. What made Besant distinctive was her ability to merge Theosophy with broader reform agendas, education, labor issues, and later Indian self-rule. Her vision expanded the society's scope beyond esoteric doctrine into public activism. This expansion attracted admiration and suspicion in equal measure. For some, it fulfilled Theosophy's ideal of universal brotherhood in action. For others, it risked politicizing a spiritual movement and entangling it further in colonial dynamics. 5. The 1895 split, organizational fracture. By 1895, tensions between Judge and the Udyar leadership became irreconcilable. The American section, under Judge's leadership, effectively separated, forming what became the Theosophical Society in America, often associated with the Point Loma lineage in later developments. The Adyar-based society continued under Alcott and, after his death, under Besant's growing influence. This split formalized what had already become a reality. Theosophy was no longer a single unified body. It had become multiple organizations, each claiming authentic continuity with Blavatsky's vision. The schism reveals several structural truths. Esoteric authority is inherently difficult to regulate. Invisible endorsement cannot be adjudicated by committee. International movements fragment along regional lines when cultural contexts diverge. Charismatic succession often produces rival interpretations rather than smooth inheritance. Importantly, the split did not destroy Theosophy. It diversified it. Competing branches developed different emphases, some more doctrinally conservative, others more reform-oriented, others more experimental. 6. Doctrine and divergence, evolving interpretations. Post-schism Theosophy did not remain static. Without Blavatsky as final arbiter, interpretations of her teachings evolved. Questions about cosmology, evolution, masters, and practical discipline were revisited. Some factions emphasized strict fidelity to the secret doctrine, treating it as near-canonical. Others allowed for development, expanding the cosmology or incorporating new elements. This divergence reflects a broader pattern in religious history. Foundational texts become anchors, but interpretation is inevitable. The fragmentation of authority also encouraged innovation. Leaders no longer needed unanimous approval across a single global structure. This freedom would eventually enable bold developments, most notably in the Besant-Leadbeater era, where new narratives and figures would dramatically reshape the movement's public image. 7. Schism as survival mechanism. Paradoxically, schism can preserve movements. A single organization under intense internal conflict may collapse. Multiple organizations can adapt separately. Theosophy's fragmentation allowed each branch to cultivate its own identity, audiences, and strategies. This adaptability would become crucial in the 20th century. The Adyar Society would increasingly emphasize internationalism and social engagement. The American and later Point Loma branches would cultivate distinct interpretations of esoteric discipline and lineage. Each claimed legitimacy. None could erase the others. Fragmentation also diluted the impact of scandal. Critics could no longer treat Theosophy as a single monolithic fraud. It had become a plural phenomenon. 8. The deeper tension. Democracy versus esotericism. At the heart of the schism lay a structural paradox. Theosophy was organized democratically, lodges, officers, votes. Yet it grounded ultimate authority in esoteric knowledge and hidden masters. These models are uneasy companions. Democracy requires transparency and shared decision-making. Esotericism privileges secrecy and graded knowledge. When disputes arise, democratic procedure cannot easily adjudicate invisible claims. The judge controversy made this contradiction visible. The society's various branches would experiment with different balances between these poles. Some emphasized institutional governance. Others leaned more heavily into esoteric lineage. None fully resolved the tension. Unity lost, identity pluralized. The period from 1891 to 1898 transformed Theosophy from a unified movement under a dominant founder into a constellation of related but distinct organizations. Succession disputes revealed structural weaknesses, but also organizational resilience. Authority was contested, redistributed, and regionalized. The schism did not end Theosophy's influence. On the contrary, it set the stage for one of its most dramatic chapters. Under Annie Besant's leadership, soon joined by Charles Leadbeater, the Adyar branch would embark on an ambitious new project, the identification of a coming world teacher and the cultivation of a young Indian boy, Jiddu Krishnamurti, as his vehicle. That episode would test Theosophy's reconstructed authority in unprecedented ways. Having survived scandal and schism, the movement would now attempt something even more audacious: to shape the spiritual future of humanity itself. Chapter 10. The World Teacher Project. Besant, Leadbeater, and the Rise of Krishnamurti, 1899 to 1925. At the turn of the 20th century, the Theosophical Society, particularly the Adyar-based organization, entered a phase of expansion that was both organizationally successful and ideologically risky. Having survived scandal and schism, it now sought not merely to transmit doctrine, but to shape spiritual history. Under the leadership of Annie Besant and the influential clairvoyant teacher Charles W. Leadbeater, the movement developed a new center of gravity, a messianic expectation framed in theosophical terms as the coming world teacher. The World Teacher Project is one of the most consequential episodes in modern theosophical history because it illustrates how movements rebuild authority after crisis, and how that rebuilt authority can be redirected into ambitious, prophetic ventures. It also demonstrates the tension between Theosophy's universalist ideals and its reliance on hierarchical esoteric claims. The attempt to identify, educate, and present a living spiritual figure as the vehicle of a world-transforming teacher magnified both Theosophy's appeal and its vulnerabilities. This chapter examines the rise of Besant and Leadbeater's influence, the discovery and promotion of Jiddu Krishnamurti, the creation of new institutions to support the world teacher narrative, and the cultural and political consequences of this project up to the mid-1920s. The chapter does not treat Krishnamurti as merely a theosophical puppet, nor does it reduce theosophists to naive devotees. Instead, it asks historically why this project seemed plausible to its proponents, what social needs it answered, and how it reshaped the society's public identity. 1. Besant as leader, reform energy, and institutional charisma. After Alcott's death in 1907, Annie Besant became president of the Theosophical Society, Adyar. Her leadership did not arise from organizational maneuver alone. She possessed extraordinary public capacity, a background in radical politics, a talent for public speaking, and a moral seriousness that many found compelling. Besant could present Theosophy not as a fringe curiosity, but as a modern ethical movement dedicated to human improvement. This mattered because Theosophy, still shadowed by 19th-century scandal, needed public legitimacy. Besant provided it. She was recognizable as a serious reformer and intellectual. Her presence broadened the society's appeal beyond occult enthusiasts to include socially engaged idealists, especially those drawn to education, labor reform, and later Indian self-rule. Yet Besant's gifts also carried a risk common in modern movements: the fusion of institutional leadership with charismatic authority. When a leader becomes not merely an administrator but a moral symbol, the movement can become more cohesive and more fragile. It becomes vulnerable to the consequences of that leader's prophetic commitments. 2. Leadbeater, clairvoyance, controversy, and the power of inner sight. Charles W. Leadbeater became one of the most influential figures in early 20th century theosophy because he offered something the movement had always valued: experiential authority. Where doctrine could be studied and debated, Leadbeater claimed direct perception of subtle realities through clairvoyance, seeing auras, past lives, thought forms, and the invisible structure of spiritual planes. This was immensely attractive to many theosophists. After the Hodgson era, public proof through phenomena had become dangerous. Clairvoyant research, framed as disciplined inner observation, provided a different kind of authority. It restored the sense that theosophy was not mere speculation. It also supplied vivid detail that made metaphysical ideas feel concrete. Leadbeater's influence, however, was shadowed by controversy. His personal conduct and teachings attracted criticism and produced internal conflict. Yet he remained central, largely because his clairvoyant claims were not easily falsified internally. Those who believed him treated his perceptions as advanced knowledge. Those who doubted him often lacked institutional power, especially as Besant came to regard him as an important collaborator. The partnership between Besant and Leadbeater thus represents a reconfiguration of theosophical authority: administrative legitimacy fused with clairvoyant charisma. 3. The messianic impulse. Why a world teacher seemed plausible. Theosophy had long included a teleological narrative. Humanity evolves spiritually through cycles, guided by advanced intelligences. This worldview naturally lends itself to expectations of spiritual interventions, moments when higher beings act decisively in history. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were also periods of intense global anxiety and hope. Industrial modernity brought both progress and dislocation. Empire produced moral unease and political tension. Scientific advances challenged old beliefs while offering little ethical guidance. Many people searched for a unifying spiritual horizon. Within this context, the idea of a coming world teacher could seem both necessary and credible. It promised a renewed spiritual center in an era of fractured authority, a unifying figure capable of transcending religious division, a moral corrective to materialism, nationalism, and social conflict. Theosophy's universalist rhetoric made this expectation especially appealing. If all religions contain fragments of a single wisdom tradition, then it is plausible, within that worldview, that a great teacher might appear to re-articulate the tradition for modern humanity. 4. Discovering Krishnamurti, spiritual selection and colonial dynamics. In 1909, Leadbeater reportedly identified a young Indian boy, Jiddu Krishnamurti, as possessing an extraordinary aura and spiritual potential. Krishnamurti was from a Brahmin family and had been brought to the attention of theosophists near Adyar. Leadbeater's perception was interpreted not merely as personal insight, but as a cult diagnosis. This child was to be the vehicle of the world teacher. This moment is historically revealing because it shows how esoteric authority operated in practice. A clairvoyant observation became the basis for an institutional project. The child's life was redirected by an interpretive framework he did not choose. The colonial context matters here. A British-led international organization headquartered in India, selecting an Indian boy as the vessel for a world teacher is a complex act. On one level, it elevated an Indian subject to universal spiritual significance, countering colonial assumptions of Western superiority. On another level, the selection was mediated through Western esoteric authority and organizational control. The India that Theosophy honored was still filtered through theosophical structures. Krishnamurti's elevation therefore embodied Theosophy's ambivalence, anti-missionary respect entangled with paternalistic intervention. 5. Building the project. Education, protection, and institutional machinery. Once Krishnamurti was identified as significant, the society built machinery around him. Besant became his guardian, and his education was carefully shaped to prepare him for a global role. Supporters framed this as protection and training. Critics could frame it as appropriation and control. New organizations were created to support the world teacher narrative, most notably the Order of the Star in the East, founded in 1911, which aimed to prepare the world for the teacher's coming. The order provided structure, membership, meetings, publications, and an international network of expectation. Institutionally, this was brilliant. It gave Theosophy a new public mission and a rallying point that could unify disparate lodges. It also generated enthusiasm and increased recruitment. A movement with a future prophecy can mobilize energy that a movement of study sometimes cannot. But it was also perilous. Prophecy makes a movement vulnerable to disconfirmation. If the teacher does not appear or refuses the role, credibility collapses dramatically. 6. The cultural performance of expectation. The World Teacher Project was not only organizational, it was performative. It required staging expectation through lectures, rituals, publications, and events. The movement cultivated a mood of imminent transformation. It encouraged members to see themselves as participants in a world historical moment. This performance had psychological power. It offered meaning and belonging. It made individual lives feel part of a cosmic plan. It also sharpened hierarchy. Those closest to Krishnamurti, or most aligned with Leadbeater's clairvoyant guidance, gained prestige. At the same time, performance created pressure. The more public the expectation, the more difficult it became to retreat without humiliation. The society's leadership became invested not only spiritually, but reputationally. The project's success became tied to the movement's identity. 7. Theosophy and Indian politics. Besant's dual role. Besant's increasing involvement in Indian political life adds further complexity. She became associated with educational initiatives and, later, with Indian nationalist aspirations. Her political activism, most famously in the Home Rule movement, demonstrated that Theosophy could operate as more than a metaphysical school. It could be a moral and political actor. Yet this dual role also produced tension. Some Theosophists wanted the society to remain spiritually focused. Others saw political engagement as a natural extension of universal brotherhood. Colonial authorities, meanwhile, could view Theosophy with suspicion when it aligned with Indian self-rule. The movement's spiritual projects were therefore never entirely separable from political consequences. Krishnamurti, living within this environment, became entangled not only in spiritual expectation, but in the broader drama of colonial India. 8. Consequences by the mid-1920s, expansion and vulnerability. By the mid-1920s, the World Teacher Project had achieved significant organizational success. The Order of the Star had expanded internationally. Theosophy's public visibility increased. The movement developed a sense of momentum and destiny, but its vulnerabilities deepened. Authority became concentrated in Besant and Leadbeater's interpretations. The movement's reputation became tied to a single living figure. Internal dissent grew, especially among those uneasy with messianic claims or Leadbeater's influence. Krishnamurti himself matured, developing a perspective not easily controlled by organizational expectation. The stage was set for a dramatic rupture. The very project designed to secure Theosophy's future would eventually destabilize it. Prophecy as reinvention, and as risk. The World Teacher Project represents Theosophy's most ambitious reinvention after scandal and schism. It transformed the movement from a society of study into a prophetic enterprise aimed at reshaping global spiritual life. It mobilized members, expanded international networks, and offered a powerful narrative of hope in a fractured modern world. Yet prophecy is a high-stakes form of authority. It raises expectations that cannot easily be moderated, and it binds credibility to events outside institutional control. As Krishnamurti approached adulthood, the central question became unavoidable. Would he accept the role assigned to him? Chapter 11. Truth is a Pathless Land. Krishnamurti's Break and the Collapse of Theosophical Messianism, 1925 to 1935. The World Teacher Project was the most ambitious attempt in theosophical history to turn esoteric expectation into public destiny. It mobilized international networks, created institutions dedicated to spiritual preparation, and centered the movement's future on a living figure. Jiddu Krishnamurti, presented as the vehicle for a coming world teacher. Yet the project carried an unavoidable risk. The human being at its center could refuse the role. When Krishnamurti did exactly that, the consequences were not confined to one organization. They reshaped modern spiritual culture by offering a dramatic critique of authority itself. This chapter examines the decades surrounding Krishnamurti's break, the internal pressures that built through the 1920s, the dissolution of the Order of the Star in 1929, and the aftermath for the Theosophical Society through the early 1930s. The focus is not on sensationalizing conflict, but on analyzing what the rupture revealed about charismatic authority, institutional prophecy, and the ethics of spiritual leadership. 1. A project under strain, the 1920s as a pressure chamber. By the mid-1920s, the World Teacher Project had generated enormous emotional and organizational investment. The Order of the Star in the East was international. Conferences and gatherings cultivated a mood of imminent transformation. Publications reinforced the narrative that a spiritual event of global importance was approaching. This created a pressure chamber around Krishnamurti. He was expected not merely to speak, but to embody a cosmic role. Ordinary development, intellectual growth, emotional doubt, personal autonomy, was easily reinterpreted through the movement's prophetic lens. If he hesitated, it could be framed as a test. If he spoke in unconventional ways, it could be framed as preparation. The interpretive system was flexible enough to incorporate ambiguity without abandoning expectation. Such flexibility is a strength of prophetic systems. They absorb contradictions. But it is also a weakness, because it can prevent genuine self-correction. The more a movement invests in a prophecy, the more it becomes psychologically difficult to admit uncertainty. The social environment around Krishnamurti therefore became highly charged. Devotion, hope, anxiety, and organizational control intertwined. At the same time, Krishnamurti's own consciousness was evolving. He was not simply a passive recipient of training. He was a thinker and a speaker developing an increasingly distinctive perspective, one that would soon place him in direct conflict with the very structure built around him. 2. The process, experience, interpretation, and the limits of organizational framing. Accounts from the period describe Krishnamurti undergoing intense experiences, episodes of physical pain, altered consciousness, and psychological transformation, often referred to within theosophical circles as the process. The nature of these experiences has been interpreted in multiple ways: mystical awakening, psychosomatic crisis, spiritual initiation, or a complex interplay of factors shaped by the pressure of expectation. Historically, what matters is how experience and interpretation interacted. Within the theosophical framework, such experiences were easily read as confirmation, evidence that higher forces were working through him. But for Krishnamurti, experience did not necessarily reinforce institutional narrative. Experience can produce radical independence as easily as it produces devotion. A person who undergoes intense inner change may become less willing to accept external authority, even when that authority claims spiritual legitimacy. This is one of the deepest ironies of the World Teacher Project. Theosophy emphasized inner development. Yet inner development, if genuine, can undermine institutional control. A movement that claims to cultivate awakening cannot fully predict what awakened individuals will do. 3. The death of Nitya, grief as turning point. Krishnamurti's younger brother, Nitya, died in 1925. The loss was devastating. It also had spiritual implications because Nitya had been central to theosophical narratives about Krishnamurti's role and the future of the project. Some supporters had imagined Nitya as playing a significant part in the World Teacher mission. The death therefore struck at multiple levels: personal grief, organizational symbolism, and metaphysical expectation. Prophetic systems often interpret tragedy as meaningful within a cosmic plan, but grief can also expose the cruelty of such interpretation. It can make spiritual rhetoric feel hollow or manipulative. For Krishnamurti, the loss intensified a questioning that was already underway. It sharpened the sense that truth cannot be guaranteed by organizations, and that spiritual reality cannot be safely contained within narratives designed to reassure. This is not to claim that grief alone caused the break, but grief often functions historically as a catalyst. It strips away performance. It forces confrontation with vulnerability. It can accelerate ethical clarity. 4. Dissolving the Order, the 1929 rupture. In 1929, Krishnamurti dissolved the Order of the Star. The act was not a quiet administrative adjustment. It was a public rupture, delivered with language that directly challenged the foundations of organized spiritual authority. His most famous statement from this period, "Truth is a pathless land," captured the essence of his critique. Truth, he argued, cannot be approached through organizations, through beliefs, through leaders, or through structured preparation. No institution can lead a person to freedom. Spiritual liberation requires direct perception, self-understanding, and radical independence from authority. The implications for Theosophy were profound. The movement had invested decades in building a messianic structure. Krishnamurti's dissolution dismantled that structure from within. It was not skeptical exposure from outside. It was refusal from the inside. This distinction matters. The Hodgson report attacked Theosophy's credibility by accusing it of fraud. Krishnamurti attacked Theosophy's legitimacy by rejecting its authority logic. The earlier crisis questioned whether Theosophy's tokens of proof were real. This crisis questioned whether proof and authority should matter at all. 5. The immediate organizational fallout: shock, grief, and division. The response within the Theosophical Society ranged widely. Some members experienced the dissolution as betrayal. They had devoted years of hope, money, and identity to the project. For them, the collapse was traumatic, not merely ideological. Others interpreted Krishnamurti's act as part of the spiritual plan, arguing that the teacher's message might precisely be the rejection of organization. Still others were relieved, having felt uneasy about Messianism and the authority concentrated in Besant and Leadbeater's interpretations. For the Society's leadership, the rupture was destabilizing. Besant had been Krishnamurti's guardian and the project's foremost advocate. Leadbeater had been the clairvoyant authority who recognized the role. Their credibility was inevitably damaged. Even members who remained loyal had to wrestle with dissonance. How could such certainty have been invested in a role now publicly rejected? The movement's internal cohesion was strained. But, again, Theosophy did not collapse. It adapted. 6. The philosophical shock: authority, freedom, and the theosophical impulse. Krishnamurti's critique struck at a persistent tension within Theosophy. The tension between universalism and hierarchy. Theosophy's ideal of universal brotherhood suggested openness, equality, and ethical unity. Yet the movement's authority structures often depended on hierarchy: masters, initiation, graded knowledge, inner circles. The World Teacher Project had intensified this hierarchy dramatically. It offered a singular figure whose role was validated by clairvoyant authority and institutional preparation. Krishnamurti's rejection exposed the paradox. If spiritual truth is universal, why should it require an organization to mediate? If freedom is the aim, why rely on authority? His critique therefore resonated beyond Theosophy. It spoke to modern spiritual seekers who wanted depth without institutions and authenticity without hierarchy. In this sense, the rupture contributed to a broader cultural shift. The 20th century saw the growth of spiritual individualism, the belief that truth is personal, experiential, and not owned by any church. Krishnamurti became a powerful emblem of that shift. 7. Aftermath: Theosophy recenters, Krishnamurti departs. After 1929, Krishnamurti continued as an independent teacher, rejecting labels and refusing institutional frameworks. Theosophy, meanwhile, recentered itself on study, ethics, and its broader legacy rather than on prophetic fulfillment. The Society did not abandon belief in masters or spiritual evolution, but it became more cautious about public prophecy. The episode left a scar. It also produced a lesson. Messianic projects can mobilize energy, but they also risk catastrophic credibility loss when centered on living individuals. For some Theosophists, the episode was interpreted as a necessary purge, removing a distortion and returning the Society to its foundational aims. For others, it marked the beginning of a long-term decline in public influence. Both interpretations contain elements of truth. The Society survived, but it would never again command the same kind of global prophetic excitement. 8. A broader legacy: modern anti-authoritarian spirituality. Krishnamurti's break has a significance that extends beyond Theosophy. It represents a rare moment when a figure created by an institution publicly rejects the institution's authority logic and becomes a global voice for anti-authoritarian spirituality. This legacy has shaped modern spiritual culture in several ways. It legitimized skepticism towards gurus and spiritual organizations. It reinforced the modern ideal of direct experience over inherited belief. It contributed to a culture of spiritual individualism that would later expand dramatically in the late 20th century. At the same time, anti-authoritarian spirituality carries its own risks. If no structure is trusted, people may drift into shallow eclecticism or become vulnerable to informal forms of manipulation that lack accountability. Krishnamurti's critique therefore does not solve the modern problem of authority. It reframes it. Theosophy tested by refusal. The period from 1925 to 1935 tested theosophical authority in a way scandal and schism could not. Exposure attacked the movement from outside, and schism fractured it from within. But Krishnamurti's refusal undermined its most ambitious prophetic project at the moment of greatest investment. Yet the episode also reveals Theosophy's resilience. The movement absorbed the shock, recalibrated, and continued. It returned to its broader educational and philosophical identity, even as it carried the wound of public disappointment. Chapter 12. After the prophecy, Theosophy's cultural diffusion into art, psychology, education, and modern spiritual seeking, 1935, 1970s. Krishnamurti's rejection of the World Teacher Project did not end Theosophy's influence. It ended a particular mode of influence, the attempt to become the spiritual future of humanity through prophetic institution building. What followed was quieter, slower, and in some ways more consequential. Theosophy moved from the center of its own story into the background of many others. Its ideas, symbols, and habits of thought traveled outward, into art and modernist aesthetics, into new approaches to psychology and consciousness, into alternative education projects, and into the widening culture of spiritual seeking that increasingly operated outside formal religion. This chapter examines that diffusion. It argues that Theosophy's 20th century significance is best understood not through membership numbers or headquarters politics, but through cultural seepage, the way a movement's vocabulary becomes common currency, the way its metaphors shape new disciplines, and the way its practices reappear in altered forms. Theosophy's post-1930 story is therefore not primarily a story of institutional triumph or decline. It is a story of legacy, complex, uneven, and often detached from its original source. 1. Recentering after rupture, from prophetic mission to educational identity. In the decades after 1929, the Theosophical Society, especially the Adyar branch, recentered itself around safer, more durable activities: study, publishing, lecture programs, and ethical initiatives. This was not merely retreat. It was a return to older roots. Even during the movement's most sensational phases, Theosophy had always claimed that phenomena were secondary and that the real work was moral and intellectual. The collapse of the Star Project forced a kind of institutional humility. Public prophecy had proven dangerously fragile. A living vehicle could refuse, and refusal could not be legislated away. In response, Theosophy placed renewed emphasis on comparative study of religion and philosophy, ethical ideals, especially universal brotherhood and service, publishing and education as long-term influence channels, quiet lodge life rather than grand public expectation. This reorientation also shifted the movement's emotional tone. The prophetic mood of imminence faded. In its place grew a steadier culture of study, often earnest, sometimes insular, but resilient. Yet the most important thing to recognize is that Theosophy's public reduction did not equal cultural disappearance. As the organization narrowed its claims, its ideas continued to circulate widely, frequently without credit. 2. Theosophy and modern art. Abstraction, symbolism, and invisible worlds. One of the most striking arenas of theosophical diffusion was modern art, particularly early abstraction. This connection is sometimes misunderstood as a simple matter of artists believing in occultism. In reality, Theosophy offered artists a metaphysical framework that made abstraction feel legitimate rather than empty. If reality includes invisible planes, subtle forces, vibrations, and states of consciousness, then art does not have to copy surfaces. It can attempt to represent the unseen. Theosophy contributed several ideas that aligned strongly with modernist experimentation. The world as layered reality. Visible matter is only one stratum of existence. Vibration and correspondence. Colors, shapes, and sounds relate to states of being. Thought as formative power. Mental states create subtle forms and influence reality. Evolution of consciousness. Art can participate in humanity's spiritual development. Works like Thought Forms, published by Annie Besant and C. W. Leadbeater in 1901, played a particular role. Regardless of how one judges their claims, the illustrations presented a powerful visual argument that emotion and thought could be depicted as color and form. For artists searching for justification to move beyond representational painting, this was fertile ground. Theosophy's influence appears in the broader modernist tendency to treat art as more than depiction. Art as revelation, as spiritual experiment, as transformation of perception. In this sense, Theosophy did not simply influence artists. It helped legitimize a cultural move in which inner experience and metaphysical speculation became credible subjects for serious creative work. 3. Psychology and consciousness. From occult categories to modern interiority. The 20th century saw a growing fascination with consciousness, the unconscious, altered states, and the hidden structures of the psyche. Theosophy's language, planes, subtle bodies, karma as moral psychology, reincarnation as developmental narrative, was not identical to academic psychology, but it contributed to a broader cultural shift, the idea that the self is layered, complex, and capable of transformation. Theosophy offered a model of interiority that many found compelling. The self is not only a social persona, but a multi-layered being. Moral growth is not simply obedience to rules, but transformation of consciousness. Inner discipline and attention shape perception and character. Even when psychologists rejected metaphysical claims, the cultural appetite for inner exploration was expanding in ways that Theosophy had helped normalize. The movement's synthesis of ethics and inner development contributed to a climate in which talking about higher self, spiritual evolution, and inner work did not automatically sound absurd. There is also a subtler influence. Theosophy helped frame spiritual experience as something that could be discussed in quasi-systematic terms. It offered maps, categories, and developmental stages. Modern psychology would develop its own maps, often secularized, but the cultural readiness for mapping the inner life owed something to earlier esoteric systems that treated consciousness as structured and educable. This does not mean Theosophy created modern psychology. It means Theosophy participated in a wider modern movement, the interiorization of meaning, where the self becomes both problem and project. 4. Alternative education, spiritual development as pedagogy. Education was one of Theosophy's most consistent practical commitments, and its influence in alternative pedagogies is part of its long-term legacy. Theosophical education initiatives often framed schooling not merely as knowledge transfer, but as character formation and the cultivation of the whole person. Ethical, intellectual, emotional, and, in their view, spiritual. Several features of theosophical educational thinking proved culturally portable. Holistic development. Education should form the person, not just train skills. Ethics and service. Moral responsibility is a legitimate educational aim. Comparative openness. Students should encounter diverse traditions and ideas. Self-discipline and attention. Inner qualities matter as much as external achievement. These themes harmonized with broader 20th century educational reform movements that emphasized child development, experiential learning, and the formation of independent thinkers. Even where theosophical metaphysics was absent, the pedagogical ethos could remain. Education as cultivation rather than mere instruction. In post-war decades especially, as conventional religion lost cultural dominance in many Western contexts, educational models that offered moral and spiritual language without sectarian dogma found receptive audiences. Theosophy's non-creedal posture made it an early example of this approach. 5. Publishing, libraries, and the slow power of text. If Theosophy's dramatic public moments created attention, its publishing created longevity. The movement's journals, book catalogs, translations, and lecture transcripts formed a stable archive that could outlast internal crises. This is one reason Theosophy remained influential even as public interest fluctuated. A person could discover Theosophy not through lodges, but through a bookshop, a library, or a second-hand copy passed along a social network of seekers. The ideas were portable and patient. They did not require attendance at headquarters. They required reading. Theosophical publishing also trained a particular kind of seeker, the autodidact who constructs a worldview through eclectic study. This figure becomes increasingly common in the 20th century and is central to later spiritual culture. Theosophy helped normalize the idea that one could be spiritually serious without belonging to a single church, by reading across traditions and assembling meaning through comparative synthesis. 6. The spiritual but not religious prehistory, Theosophy as template. By the mid to late 20th century, many Western societies saw growing religious pluralism alongside declining trust in traditional institutions. People increasingly describe themselves as seeking spirituality rather than belonging to religion. This cultural pattern did not begin in the 1960s, but it accelerated there. Theosophy, founded in 1875, appears in hindsight as an early template. Several core features of modern seeking culture were already present in Theosophy. Eclecticism. Truth can be approached through multiple traditions. Experience and development. Spirituality is something you do and become, not merely something you believe. Anti-dogmatism. Institutional authority is suspect. Personal inquiry is prized. Moral language without church control. Ethics can be universal rather than sectarian. Theosophy also contributed to the widespread circulation of concepts that later became almost commonplace. Karma, reincarnation, spiritual evolution, subtle energies. Many people who use these words do not realize their modern Western popularity was shaped substantially by 19th century movements that promoted them in English-language publics. This is not to claim that Theosophy owns these concepts. Many originate in Asian traditions with deep histories. But the pathway by which these concepts entered modern Western popular culture often ran through theosophical networks of translation, reinterpretation, and publishing. 7. Costs and complications. Simplification, misuse, and the ethics of borrowing. Diffusion has consequences. When ideas travel widely, they often become thinner. They detach from context and turn into slogans. Theosophy's cultural afterlife includes genuine intellectual enrichment, but it also includes distortion. 3 complications are especially important. Simplification of Asian traditions. Concepts like karma and reincarnation can be detached from their ethical and philosophical frameworks and turned into casual explanations for luck, suffering, or romantic destiny. This can produce moral cruelty, they deserved it, or lazy metaphysics. Spiritual hierarchy as social hierarchy. Theosophical language about evolution, planes, and advancement can be repurposed into ego inflation, I'm more evolved than others, or into spiritualized inequality. Even when the movement preached brotherhood, its hierarchies could be misused. Appropriation without accountability. Borrowing symbols and practices from indigenous, Asian, or other traditions without understanding community meaning can reproduce colonial patterns, especially when combined with commercialization. These problems are not uniquely theosophical. They are endemic to modern spiritual marketplaces. But Theosophy's very success at making ideas portable contributed to the risk that those ideas would be used without ethical discipline. 8. Post-war modernity. Why Theosophy still fit. The mid-20th century, especially after World War II, produced conditions that made Theosophy's underlying impulse relevant again, even as the organization itself remained relatively modest in public presence. War, genocide, technological power, and ideological conflict intensified the question modernity keeps asking. What is human life for? Material progress looked morally ambiguous. Traditional religion, for many, seemed unable to address the scale of modern catastrophe without either retreating into dogma or collapsing into platitudes. Theosophy's promise, a synthesis of moral meaning, evolution, and plural tradition, could still appeal to those searching for depth without sectarianism. Even where Theosophy was not adopted as an identity, its style of thought could be. It offered a way to speak about spiritual purpose without returning to rigid orthodoxy. A movement becomes a genealogy. Between 1935 and the 1970s, Theosophy increasingly functioned as a genealogy rather than a headline. Its greatest influence lay in the way its ideas seeded other domains. Modern art's search for invisible reality, psychology's fascination with layered consciousness, alternative education's emphasis on whole-person development, and the expanding culture of spiritual seeking that preferred experience and pluralism over creed and institution. This diffusion complicates any simple judgment of Theosophy as either success or failure. Institutionally, the society did not become the world-transforming body its prophetic moments imagined. Culturally, however, Theosophy helped shape the language through which modern people, especially in the West, learn to talk about spirituality outside traditional religion. Chapter 13. New Age, Neo-Esotericism, and the Digital Turn. Theosophy's late 20th and early 21st century afterlife, 1970s, present. By the 1970s, Theosophy had largely ceased to be a headline movement. It was not gone. It was simply no longer the primary banner under which most seekers gathered. Yet its vocabulary, cosmology, and spiritual habits of thought were everywhere. Reappearing in new guises across the New Age boom, alternative healing cultures, self-development movements, and later the online spiritual marketplace. Theosophy's influence in this period is best described as a set of carrier concepts, ideas that travel easily, detach from institutional origin, and attach themselves to new practices and communities. This chapter traces that afterlife from the late 20th century into the digital present. It examines how theosophical themes were absorbed into New Age culture, how esoteric ideas were repackaged for mass consumption, how academic scholarship and skeptical critique developed in parallel, and how the internet transformed access, authority, and misuse. The central argument is that Theosophy's most significant modern role is not as a single organized movement, but as a template, a way of imagining spirituality as global, evolutionary, experiential, and non-sectarian, sometimes ethically serious, sometimes flattened into product. 1. The New Age boom. Why theosophical ideas traveled so well. The New Age boom of the 1970s and 1980s was not one movement, but a loose cultural field. Workshops, bookstores, channel teachings, alternative therapies, meditation practices, self-help spirituality, ecological mysticism, and revived occult currents. What united this field was less doctrine than mood, optimism about transformation, suspicion of institutional religion, and a desire for a spirituality compatible with modern life. Theosophy fitted this ecosystem almost perfectly. Long before New Age became a label, Theosophy had already normalized several principles that the New Age took for granted. Spiritual eclecticism. Truth can be approached through multiple traditions. Evolutionary spirituality. Humanity is developing towards higher consciousness. Subtle realities. Energies, planes, bodies, and unseen forces shape experience. Practical seeking. Reading, meditation, and inner work matter more than creed. Universalism. Religions share an underlying unity or common source. Because Theosophy had already translated many Asian concepts into English-language metaphysical vocabulary, those concepts could be picked up by later seekers without requiring deep engagement with the communities and texts from which they originated. This portability made diffusion easy, but also ethically risky, as we will see. 2. Ascended Masters and the mass market afterlife of theosophical hierarchy. One of the clearest lines of descent runs through the modern Ascended Masters tradition, popular in various New Age channel teachings and spiritual communities. While this modern form is not simply Theosophy, it echoes Theosophy's earlier master narrative. Advanced beings guiding humanity, communicating through intermediaries, and directing a long arc of spiritual evolution. The modernized version often shifts tone, from discipline to affirmation, from ethical service to personal empowerment, from initiation to consumer access. Receive messages now. In classic Theosophy, the master narrative was framed as morally demanding. Spiritual development required self-control, altruism, and long-term effort. In much of the New Age marketplace, the same narrative can become frictionless, available without sacrifice, packaged as comfort, and shaped to the listener's desires. This shift matters. Hierarchical spiritual systems can encourage humility and discipline, but they can also encourage dependency and status games. In their mass market form, masters can become spiritual celebrities who validate people's identities and ambitions, sometimes at the expense of reality testing and accountability. The question for historians is not whether modern seekers should use these ideas, but how the ideas change when they become products. Theosophy's afterlife shows a consistent pattern. When esoteric hierarchy is commercialized, its ethical demands tend to thin out while its emotional rewards intensify. 3. Karma, reincarnation, and the ethics of simplification. Few concepts have traveled more widely than karma and reincarnation. In contemporary popular spirituality, karma is often reduced to a vague notion of cosmic payback or luck. Reincarnation is frequently treated as a romantic narrative we've loved before, or as a personal mythic framework for self-understanding. Theosophy played a major role in making these concepts feel plausible within modern Western discourse, especially by linking them to evolutionary narratives. The soul develops across lifetimes. Moral law operates across time. Suffering and growth are linked within a cosmic pedagogy. But the modern simplification carries ethical danger. When karma is used as an explanation for suffering, it can become a tool of cruelty, implying that victims deserve harm, discouraging compassion and structural analysis, turning injustice into spiritual lesson rather than moral emergency. Responsible spiritual use of karma would require what Theosophy often claimed to insist upon: compassion, humility, and refusal to use metaphysics as blame. Yet in popular discourse, these safeguards are often absent. The concept becomes a moral shortcut. The digital era intensifies this risk because bite-sized content rewards confident moral pronouncements. A complex ethical doctrine becomes a slogan. Theosophy's role in popularizing these concepts, therefore, has a double legacy. It widened moral imagination, and it helped make possible certain modern misuses. For crystals, energy work, and the modern body of subtle forces. The late 20th century saw explosive growth in alternative healing cultures. Crystal healing, aura reading, chakra systems, Reiki, and related energy modalities, and a wide array of vibrational therapies. Not all of these derive from theosophy, and many have diverse origins. However, theosophy provided a conceptual climate in which such practices could feel intellectually coherent. The body is multi-layered. Subtle energies interact with emotions and thought. Health is linked to spiritual development. Unseen forces are real and actionable. Theosophy also helped normalize the idea that spiritual truth could be approached through research of inner perception. This legitimized a class of claims that sit between religion and science. Not conventional faith, not conventional empiricism, but experiential authority. That authority can be helpful. People can find meaning, calm, and community through such practices. It can also become predatory. The more a practice claims invisible knowledge, the easier it becomes to charge money for certainty, to discourage medical care, or to claim special status without accountability. Theosophical history is instructive here because it demonstrates the long-standing problem. How do you evaluate claims in domains that resist external verification? The movement never solved this fully, and neither has modern spiritual culture. 5. Scholarship and skepticism, two modern mirrors of theosophy. The late 20th century also produced two parallel developments that shaped theosophy's afterlife. The growth of academic study of Western esotericism. Scholars increasingly treated movements like theosophy as serious historical subjects rather than fringe curiosities. This reframed theosophy as a key part of modern religious history, a bridge between occult revival, comparative religion, colonial knowledge networks, and modern spiritual individualism. The consolidation of skeptical and debunking traditions. Skeptical writers continued to cite the Hodgson era and later controversies as evidence that theosophy's origins were fraudulent. In popular memory, theosophy remained strongly associated with the question, was Blavatsky a fraud? These two mirrors, scholarship and skepticism, operate differently. Scholarship aims to understand how movements function socially and historically, without requiring metaphysical endorsement. Skepticism aims to adjudicate credibility claims, often prioritizing exposure narratives. Both perspectives have shaped modern reception. The result is that contemporary readers often encounter theosophy through one of two frames, either as a historically important movement that shaped modern spirituality or as a cautionary tale about deception. In reality, theosophy's story is not reducible to either. It is a movement with genuine cultural contributions and genuine ethical problems, imaginative synthesis and damaging hierarchies, sincere seekers and institutional failures. 6. The internet changes everything. Access without apprenticeship. The most profound shift in theosophy's modern afterlife is the digital turn. The internet changed not only distribution, but authority. In earlier eras, the typical pathway into theosophy involved some form of apprenticeship. Reading circles, lodges, lectures, mentors, and a gradual introduction to dense texts. This social pathway provided context and, at least in principle, ethical framing. It also limited access. You needed proximity to institutions or libraries, and you needed time. The internet removed most barriers. Now, primary texts are downloadable instantly. Internal disputes and schisms are searchable. Scans of old journals circulate widely. Excerpts are posted without surrounding argument. Anyone can claim to teach or interpret. This produces two contradictory outcomes. Democratization. People can read for themselves. No single lodge or leader can monopolize interpretation. Historical claims can be checked against archives. Competing narratives are visible. Fragmentation. Readers can assemble a worldview from isolated fragments. Chronology collapses. Polemic is mistaken for doctrine. Context disappears. Authority becomes performative, measured by confidence and follower count rather than depth of study. In short, the internet creates access without apprenticeship. That is both liberating and dangerous. 7. Algorithmic spirituality. The new lodge is a feed. Digital platforms do not distribute ideas neutrally. They sort content through algorithms that reward engagement, emotion, certainty, outrage, fascination. This changes the kind of theosophy that thrives online. Slow, dense study does not perform well in feeds. Dramatic claims do. Hidden masters reveal. Your past life explains. This is why you're chosen. The secret truth religions hide. These motifs echo 19th century patterns, hidden knowledge, special initiation, but they are intensified by platform incentives. The result is an environment where the most sensational fragments of esotericism circulate fastest, often detached from theosophy's more ethically demanding elements. This is not only a media problem, it is a moral one. When spirituality becomes algorithmically shaped, it tends to favor emotional certainty over disciplined inquiry. Theosophy's long struggle with credibility and spectacle becomes newly relevant because the digital economy rewards precisely what earlier theosophists claimed to resist: spiritual theater. 8. Misuse in the modern world. Racism, conspiracy, and spiritual bypassing. The digital era has also made it easier for harmful repurposings to spread. Spiritualized hierarchy and racism. Theosophy's historical entanglement with evolutionary and race language has been selectively exploited by people seeking esoteric justification for supremacist beliefs. Even when mainstream theosophists emphasize brotherhood, the existence of hierarchical metaphors can be weaponized. Online, selective quoting can strip away mitigating context and present troubling material as spiritual truth. Conspiracy culture. The hidden truth structure of esotericism can be pulled into modern conspiracism. Theosophy is not the same as conspiracy culture, but certain motifs, secret masters, hidden councils, concealed history, can be repurposed into paranoid frameworks that demonize institutions and encourage distrust of evidence. When these motifs merge with social media outrage cycles, they can become socially toxic. Spiritual bypassing. A softer but widespread misuse is spiritual bypassing, using metaphysical language to avoid accountability, grief, or practical action. Everything happens for a reason, becomes an excuse not to intervene. Its karma becomes a reason not to care. This misuse is ethically corrosive because it turns spiritual language into avoidance. Theosophy's best ethical teaching runs directly against these misuses. But the afterlife of ideas is not controlled by their creators. This is why responsible reading matters more now than ever. 9. Theosophy today. Small institutions, large echoes. In the present, theosophy exists institutionally as continuing organizations, lodges, study groups, and publishing bodies. Yet its largest impact is indirect. Many people live in a conceptual world shaped partly by theosophical diffusion without knowing it. Spiritual evolution as personal development. Eclecticism as normal. Karma and reincarnation as plausible. The self as layered. Consciousness as transformative. This is theosophy's paradox. It is culturally influential precisely because it became less visible as itself. Like many foundational movements, it survives as background structure. 10. Responsible reading in the digital era, a practical ethic. If theosophy's modern afterlife is shaped by access, fragmentation, and algorithmic distortion, what does responsible reading look like? A historically grounded ethic might include chronology. Read texts in order. Do not treat late elaborations as original doctrine. Genre awareness. Polemic, private letters, and lecture rhetoric are not the same thing. Context. Recognize colonial-era categories and the intellectual climate that shaped them. Ethical testing. Ask whether an interpretation increases compassion and responsibility or inflates ego and blame. Humility about other traditions. Respect living communities. Avoid treating cultures as symbolic supply. This is not an attempt to police belief. It is an attempt to prevent harm, especially in a landscape where spiritual language can easily become a weapon or a commodity. Theosophy as modernity's recurring experiment. From the 1970s to the digital present, theosophy has functioned as modernity's recurring experiment in spiritual synthesis. Sometimes inspiring, sometimes distorted, often invisible as an origin. It helped build the conceptual infrastructure of contemporary spiritual seeking. Pluralism, inner development, subtle realities, and evolutionary purpose. It also helped generate vulnerabilities that modern culture continues to wrestle with: spectacle-based authority, spiritual hierarchy, appropriation, and the temptation of hidden explanations. Chapter 14. What Theosophy Still Asks: Freedom, Authority, Ethics, and the search for a spiritual modernity. The history traced through this book has been crowded with drama, charismatic founders and scandal, revelations and investigations, schism and prophetic ambition, rupture and quiet diffusion. Yet beneath the shifting episodes lies a remarkably consistent problem, one that is not unique to Theosophy, but which Theosophy makes unusually visible. It is the problem of spiritual modernity, how to pursue meaning, transcendence, and moral purpose in a world where traditional religious authority is contested, where scientific explanation is powerful but often ethically silent, and where cultural exchange is shaped by inequality. Theosophy was one of the earliest large-scale attempts to answer that problem in a recognizably modern form. It refused the choice between orthodox creed and reductive materialism. It insisted that spiritual experience and moral law mattered. It spoke in the language of progress, evolution, and investigation. And it built institutions capable of carrying those claims across continents. Its successes and failures therefore illuminate a question that still confronts contemporary seekers. What kind of spirituality is possible after the collapse of unquestioned authority? This final chapter draws together the book's themes by treating Theosophy as a long experiment in four tensions: freedom and authority, universalism and cultural difference, inner development and ethical responsibility, and knowledge and evidence. It then considers what can be learned, without either romanticizing or dismissing the movement. 1. Freedom and authority. The paradox Theosophy never resolved. From the beginning, Theosophy promised freedom. It invited people to study, question, compare, and seek. It framed itself as non-dogmatic and open to inquiry. This openness was part of its modern appeal. It allowed spiritually serious people to step outside orthodox religion without stepping into emptiness. Yet Theosophy also relied on authority, often in intensified forms. The movement's authority structures shifted across time, but the basic pattern persisted. Charismatic authority, Blavatsky's persona and synthesis. Textual authority, Isis unveiled, the secret doctrine, letters, teachings. Esoteric authority, masters, initiation, inner circles. Institutional authority, presidents, headquarters, rules, discipline. Prophetic authority, the World Teacher Project. The paradox is simple. A movement that rejects external religious authority must still answer the question of legitimacy. Theosophy answered it repeatedly by creating new authorities. Each created stability, and each created vulnerability. Krishnamurti's "Truth is a pathless land" moment is instructive here, not because it settles the matter, but because it dramatizes the tension. He rejected institutional mediation as incompatible with freedom. Yet his own influence shows that authority does not disappear when organizations dissolve. It relocates into charisma, into personal teaching, into cultural prestige. The problem is not whether authority exists. It is how authority is held, tested, and made accountable. What Theosophy demonstrates, painfully and clearly, is that freedom without structure can drift, but structure without humility can dominate. Modern spiritual life continues to oscillate between these poles. 2. Universalism and cultural difference, brotherhood in a world shaped by power. Theosophy's slogan of universal brotherhood remains one of its most ethically compelling features. In an era of sectarian rivalry and colonial hierarchy, the insistence on human unity had real moral force. The movement defended Asian traditions against missionary contempt and helped create a cultural climate in which Hindu and Buddhist ideas could be taken seriously by Western readers. And yet universalism is not automatically justice. Theosophy's history demonstrates how easily universal rhetoric can coexist with unequal structures. The movement's relationship to Asian traditions illustrates the dilemma. It admired and publicly defended Hindu and Buddhist philosophies. It also often filtered them through Western esoteric categories. It sometimes claimed access to a hidden truth behind living traditions, implicitly placing theosophical interpretation above local religious authority. It operated within empire-era knowledge systems that shaped what India and the East meant in Western imagination. This is not a reason to dismiss Theosophy entirely. It is a reason to read it ethically and historically. Theosophy's universalism was genuine in aspiration, but it was shaped by the limits of its time. It both challenged and reproduced colonial patterns. That duality is part of its legacy. The modern lesson is not avoid all borrowing. It is, borrowing requires accountability. Respect for cultural difference is not achieved by declaring unity. It is achieved by practicing humility, learning history, and recognizing power. 3. Inner development and ethical responsibility. The danger of spiritual bypassing. Theosophy consistently emphasized inner development, self-discipline, moral purification, and the long arc of spiritual evolution. This emphasis helped many people treat spirituality as serious work rather than sentimental comfort. It encouraged self-examination and ethical aspiration. At the same time, Theosophy's metaphysical frameworks could be misused. The language of karma, evolution, and spiritual stages can become a way to explain away suffering rather than respond to it. It can become a tool for moral distancing. It is their karma. They must learn their lesson. They are less evolved. This is the perennial danger of metaphysical systems. They can be used to interpret suffering instead of relieving it. In the worst cases, they become a spiritualized justification for inequality. In softer cases, they become spiritual bypassing, using cosmic narratives to avoid grief, conflict, or responsibility. Theosophy's best ethical impulse cuts against this. Universal brotherhood implies compassion in practice. Service implies obligation. The movement repeatedly claimed that true knowledge is inseparable from ethics. The modern question, then, is practical. Does a spiritual framework increase compassion, responsibility, and courage, or does it increase blame, superiority, and avoidance? Theosophy's history provides abundant examples of both tendencies. Its value lies partly in forcing that ethical test. 4. Knowledge and evidence, the Victorian debate that never ended. Theosophy emerged in a credibility culture obsessed with proof. Spiritualists claimed evidence of the afterlife. Scientists demanded external verification. Psychical researchers tried to adjudicate contested phenomena. Theosophy tried to occupy an unstable middle ground. It claimed investigation while insisting that spiritual realities require inner development to perceive. The movement's credibility crises, Udyar, the Hodgson Report, show what happens when extraordinary claims collide with modern standards of verification. Yet the deeper issue remains unresolved in contemporary culture. People still report experiences that do not fit conventional scientific frameworks. People still seek meaning beyond materialism. Institutions still struggle to adjudicate claims involving inner life, altered states, and spiritual perception. The lesson here is not that Theosophy proves or disproves the existence of hidden realities. The lesson is that evidence is always bound to a theory of knowing. Theosophy's conflict with investigators was partly a conflict over method. What counts as proof, and who has authority to interpret it? In the digital era, the same problem appears in a new form. Online spiritual culture is saturated with claims, channeling, energy diagnoses, past life readings, offered with confidence and often without accountability. Theosophy's 19th century struggles anticipate this environment. It reminds us that modernity's hunger for proof can be exploited as easily as it can be satisfied. A responsible spirituality may therefore require a double discipline: openness to experience and commitment to reality testing, willingness to wonder and willingness to question. 5. Theosophy as a template. What endures, even when names fade? As shown in the previous chapters, Theosophy's most enduring influence is often indirect. Many contemporary spiritual assumptions resemble Theosophy's template: eclectic study across traditions, spiritual evolution as a moral narrative, karma and reincarnation as plausible frameworks, a layered model of selfhood, the idea that consciousness can be trained and transformed. Even people who have never heard of Blavatsky or Udyar may inhabit a cultural world shaped partly by these ideas. Theosophy is therefore best understood not only as an organization, but as a historical bridge, one of the channels through which a modern, plural, post-creedal spirituality became thinkable. But templates are not neutral. They carry embedded risks: hierarchy, appropriation, sensationalism, and the temptation of totalizing explanation. 6. A practical conclusion. How to read Theosophy now. The question, what does Theosophy mean today, cannot be answered by a single verdict. The movement contains multiple legacies. It can be read as a serious attempt to make ethics and spirituality compatible with modernity, a key conduit in the global circulation of religious ideas, a cautionary tale about authority, charisma, and scandal, an early blueprint for the spiritual but not religious world, a site where colonial-era categories both challenged and persisted. To read Theosophy responsibly now, one might adopt a set of practices rather than a conclusion. Read historically. Keep chronology and context visible. Resist treating later elaborations as original core. Read ethically. Ask what an idea does to compassion and responsibility, not only what it claims about the cosmos. Read with humility. Recognize the difference between learning from traditions and using them as symbolic supply. Read with discernment. Treat extraordinary claims with openness and rigorous caution. Avoid turning doubt into cynicism or belief into certainty. Read with awareness of power. Universalism does not erase hierarchy. Brotherhood must be tested in practice. The question that remains. Theosophy began with a refusal. The refusal to accept that modernity must be spiritually empty. It insisted that human life has depth, that consciousness matters, and that moral law may be woven into the fabric of reality. Whether or not one accepts its metaphysical claims, that insistence speaks to a real modern hunger. But Theosophy also demonstrates the cost of trying to satisfy that hunger with total systems, hidden authorities, and spectacular proofs. It shows how easily spiritual longing can be harnessed by hierarchy, how easily universalism can coexist with unequal power, and how easily the desire for meaning can drift into certainty. What remains, then, is not an answer, but a question. One that Theosophy never stopped asking, even when it stumbled over its own contradictions. Can we build a spirituality that is free without being rootless, universal without being appropriative, ethically serious without being cruel, and open to mystery without surrendering discernment? Theosophy's long experiment does not resolve this, but it leaves a record, rich, messy, and instructive, of what happens when modern people attempt to live the question in public. Chapter 15. Reassessing Theosophy. Race, Orientalism, Scholarship, and the Ethics of Historical Judgment. No serious modern study of Theosophy can avoid confronting the questions that contemporary scholarship has brought into sharper focus. Race theory, Orientalism, colonial knowledge production, esoteric authority, and the ethics of interpretation. Earlier defenders and critics often framed Theosophy in binary terms, either visionary wisdom tradition or elaborate fraud. Contemporary historiography complicates that simplicity. It asks not only what happened, but how ideas functioned within power structures, and what ethical consequences followed. This chapter does not attempt to prosecute or absolve. Instead, it situates Theosophy within the intellectual and colonial conditions of its time, while acknowledging that historical explanation does not erase moral consequence. Theosophy was both progressive and problematic, emancipatory and entangled. Understanding that duality is essential for responsible scholarship. 1. The race question, evolutionary metaphor, and hierarchical risk. Theosophy emerged during a period saturated with evolutionary thinking. After Darwin, evolution became a master metaphor across disciplines: biology, sociology, anthropology, psychology, and religion. Hierarchies of development were assumed not only for species, but for cultures and races. Theosophical anthropology, particularly in The Secret Doctrine, adopted a root race framework in which humanity was described as evolving through stages. While some theosophists interpreted these stages symbolically or cosmologically, the terminology was unavoidably embedded in 19th-century racial discourse. 3 points require careful distinction. Theosophy rejected crude biological racism in some respects, especially missionary claims of European spiritual superiority. It elevated Indian philosophy and asserted spiritual equality in principle. It nonetheless used hierarchical evolutionary language common to its era, sometimes describing stages of development in ways that mirrored contemporary anthropological assumptions. Later readers could, and sometimes did, interpret these ideas in biologically or culturally supremacist ways, even if that was not always the author's explicit intention. The ethical issue here is not resolved by pointing out that such language was normal for its time. Historical context explains prevalence. It does not eliminate impact. Theosophy reflects the transitional moment in which spiritual universalism coexisted with hierarchical evolutionary frameworks. That tension remains instructive. Modern scholarship therefore approaches theosophical race theory neither as uniquely monstrous nor as harmless metaphor. It treats it as part of the broader entanglement between spiritual cosmology and 19th-century developmentalism. 2. Orientalism and the construction of ancient wisdom. Theosophy's relationship to Asian traditions must also be reassessed through the lens of Orientalism, a term describing the ways Western intellectual culture historically constructed the East as exotic, mystical, timeless, and spiritually superior or inferior depending on need. Theosophy differed from missionary Orientalism in tone. It was admiring rather than dismissive. It defended Hinduism and Buddhism publicly and insisted they contained profound philosophical depth. This mattered in colonial discourse. Yet admiration does not automatically equal accurate representation. Theosophy, frequently, presented India as a spiritual reservoir rather than a politically complex, socially stratified society. Treated Asian traditions as fragments of a single wisdom religion, often reinterpreted through Western esoteric frameworks. Claimed access to a hidden esoteric core behind public religion. These moves were not unique to Theosophy. They were common within comparative religion and occult revival circles. But they reveal a structural pattern. The East became symbolic capital in Western spiritual reconstruction. At the same time, Theosophy's cross-cultural exchanges were not purely extractive. Indian reformers engaged Theosophists strategically. Alliances were mutual, even if asymmetrical. The story is not one-directional appropriation. It is a complex field of translation, projection, and collaboration within imperial constraints. Modern historiography, therefore, treats Theosophy as part of the globalization of religion, both expanding awareness and participating in colonial framing. 3. Fraud, belief, and the limits of exposure narratives. The question, was Blavatsky a fraud, has dominated popular discussion for over a century. While credibility debates are historically important, they often obscure larger dynamics. 3. Analytical distinctions help. Fraud as deliberate deception. Myth-making as symbolic narrative construction. Sincere belief operating within imaginative cosmology. Historical actors can inhabit ambiguous zones between these categories. Religious history is full of figures who experienced, exaggerated, interpreted, or dramatized events in ways that do not fit cleanly into criminal or purely delusional models. Exposure narratives like the Hodgson Report offer moral clarity. They categorize movements decisively. But modern scholarship increasingly recognizes that such clarity can oversimplify. Investigations are themselves shaped by ideology, institutional prestige, and cultural bias. This does not require romantic rehabilitation. It requires methodological caution. The historian's task is to understand how authority was constructed, why people believed, and how narratives operated socially, not merely to pass verdict. Theosophy becomes more interesting, not less, when examined as a case study in how modern spiritual authority is manufactured, contested, defended, and reimagined. 4. Gender, power, and spiritual leadership. Theosophy's role in expanding women's leadership deserves particular scholarly attention. Helena Blavatsky and Annie Besant were not peripheral participants, they were central architects. In an era when many institutions excluded women from authority, Theosophy created visible space for female intellectual and spiritual leadership. Yet gender empowerment existed alongside hierarchical structures that could still replicate power imbalance. Charismatic authority does not eliminate inequality, it reshapes it. Scholars increasingly view Theosophy as part of a broader pattern in modern esotericism. Movements that both challenge and reproduce social norms. Women gained voice and influence. Simultaneously, spiritual hierarchy could still centralize power in ways that complicated autonomy. The history resists simplification. It shows genuine expansion of roles and persistent structural tensions. 5. Esotericism as modern strategy. One of the most important historiographical developments of the late 20th century was the academic recognition of Western esotericism as a legitimate field of study. Rather than dismissing esoteric movements as fringe, scholars began analyzing them as integral to modern intellectual history. From this perspective, Theosophy appears not as aberration, but as a strategic response to modern fragmentation. Esotericism offered a way to reconcile science and religion, a narrative of hidden unity beneath cultural difference, a disciplined path for personal transformation, a sense of depth in an increasingly materialist age. Esoteric structures also offer something modern institutions often lack: experiential authority. When churches weaken and scientific materialism feels morally thin, esoteric systems step into the gap. Understanding Theosophy as strategy, rather than anomaly, clarifies why it continues to resonate. It addressed real anxieties and offered structured meaning. Its persistence reflects the persistence of those anxieties. 6. The ethical problem of legacy. Modern readers inherit Theosophy's ideas in a different world. Post-colonial, digitally saturated, skeptical of hierarchy, yet hungry for meaning. The ethical question becomes, what do we do with inherited frameworks shaped by outdated categories? Three possible responses appear in contemporary discourse. Rejection. Dismiss the entire system as historically compromised. Sanitization. Retain appealing elements while ignoring problematic ones. Critical integration. Engage honestly with historical limitations while extracting enduring ethical insight. The third approach is the most intellectually responsible. It refuses nostalgia and refuses erasure. It recognizes that intellectual history is rarely pure. Most traditions contain insight entangled with context-bound assumptions. Theosophy's universal brotherhood remains ethically compelling. Its hierarchical evolutionary metaphors require caution. Its comparative impulse opened doors. Its authority structures produced harm and inspiration in equal measure. Scholarly reassessment does not end the conversation. It makes it more honest. Theosophy as a mirror of modernity. Theosophy's history is not simply about a cult revival or 19th century scandal. It is a mirror of modernity's unresolved tensions. How to integrate science and spirituality. How to honor cultural diversity without appropriation. How to construct authority without domination. How to pursue transformation without self-deception. It reveals the creativity and danger inherent in spiritual synthesis. It shows how universalist ideals can coexist with hierarchical blind spots. It demonstrates that modern spirituality is neither naive nor fully emancipated. It is an ongoing negotiation. If theosophy matters today, it is because it shows, early, vividly, and at scale, what happens when modern people attempt to build a global, non-sectarian spirituality inside systems shaped by empire, evolutionism, and emerging scientific rationality. It did not resolve modernity's spiritual crisis, but it made the crisis visible. And in doing so, it helped shape the terrain on which that crisis continues to be lived. Conclusion. Theosophy and the problem of spiritual modernity. This book has traced theosophy not as a curiosity on the fringe of modern history, but as one of the earliest large-scale experiments in building a spirituality that could survive modernity's fractures. From its founding in New York in 1875 through its relocation to India, its crises of credibility, its doctrinal consolidation, its schisms and prophetic ambitions, and its later diffusion into wider culture, theosophy repeatedly returned to the same central task: to restore coherence without returning to orthodox authority, and to preserve meaning without rejecting modern knowledge. Theosophy's story is therefore larger than the movement itself. It is a history of how modern people have tried to live with two pressures at once: the pressure of disenchantment, science, secularization, and institutional doubt, and the pressure of longing, the persistent sense that consciousness, ethics, and human purpose cannot be reduced to matter alone. Theosophy did not resolve that tension, but it made it visible, and it offered one influential set of strategies for navigating it. Those strategies helped shape the modern spiritual landscape, even where theosophy's name faded. 1. What theosophy attempted. Theosophy attempted a synthesis. It insisted that no single tradition owned truth, that spiritual insight could be approached through comparative study, and that modern science did not exhaust reality. It proposed an evolutionary view of the cosmos and of humanity, one in which moral development mattered and human life was part of a long arc of consciousness. It introduced many Western readers to concepts associated with Asian traditions: karma, reincarnation, cycles of development, and framed these not as exotic curiosities but as ethical and metaphysical principles that could make modern life intelligible. In organizational terms, theosophy also attempted something rare: a transnational spiritual association that positioned itself as non-sectarian and modern. It used print culture, lecture circuits, lodges, and later educational work to build a durable network. It aimed to be both rational and mystical, both philosophical and practical, both global and ethically grounded in brotherhood. This ambition explains why theosophy mattered. It did not simply offer ideas. It offered a way of being religious, or spiritually serious, after traditional religious authority had become contested. 2. What theosophy revealed about authority. Yet the movement's ambition created its central vulnerability: authority. A spirituality that rejects orthodox institutions must still answer questions of legitimacy. Who decides what is true? What counts as evidence? Who may teach, interpret, or lead? Theosophy answered these questions repeatedly by creating new authorities, often in intensified forms. At first it leaned on charismatic authority. Blavatsky's synthesis, confidence, and aura of hidden connection. Then it leaned on textual authority. Major works such as Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine. It leaned on esoteric authority, masters, letters, and graded inner knowledge. It leaned on institutional authority, headquarters, presidents, rules, and discipline. And in the early 20th century, it leaned on prophetic authority, the World Teacher Project. Each form of authority gave theosophy cohesion and reach. Each also created conditions for crisis. The Mahatma letters anchored legitimacy, but they also invited exposure. The Adyar scandal and the Hodgson report show what happens when spectacular tokens of authority collide with modern scrutiny. The schisms after Blavatsky's death show what happens when esoteric legitimacy becomes contested and governance cannot easily adjudicate invisible claims. The Krishnamurti rupture shows what happens when a movement invests its future in prophecy and the living person at its center refuses the role. If there is a consistent lesson in these episodes, it is this: modern spiritual movements cannot escape the authority problem, only reshape it. Even anti-authoritarian spirituality develops its own forms of influence and prestige. Theosophy's history is therefore a caution not against spirituality itself, but against untested authority, whether institutional, charismatic, textual, or revealed. 3. What Theosophy contributed, and why it endured. Despite crisis and fragmentation, Theosophy endured because it met real needs. It provided a framework for meaning in a world where traditional faith and modern science often seem to speak past each other. It gave seekers language for inner life, layers of consciousness, moral growth, and the possibility of transformation. It offered ethical aspiration, brotherhood, service, and self-discipline. It provided a comparative imagination, a way of thinking across traditions rather than within one closed system. Over time, the movement's most powerful influence became indirect. Theosophy helped normalize a style of modern seeking that is now widespread. Eclectic reading, spiritual development as personal project, ethical language detached from church authority, and a willingness to treat consciousness as more than material process. Many concepts that circulate casually in contemporary spirituality entered modern Western publics through pathways Theosophy helped expand, even when later users had no awareness of that origin. The movement's cultural diffusion into modern art, alternative education, metaphysical publishing, and later New Age spiritualities is therefore not a footnote. It is part of Theosophy's historical significance. The organization did not become the world-transforming authority its most ambitious moments imagined, but its ideas became part of the modern spiritual bloodstream. 4. The limits and harms. What must be faced honestly. Theosophy's legacy is not pure. Its universal brotherhood ideal coexisted with conceptual frameworks shaped by 19th-century developmentalism and imperial knowledge systems. The movement sometimes treated Asian traditions with genuine respect and sometimes with interpretive appropriation, reframing living religions as fragments of a hidden wisdom religion that Theosophy claimed to recover. Theosophical evolutionary language, especially around root races, was embedded in a period when hierarchies of civilization and race were common, and even when theosophists rejected crude missionary contempt, their systems could still reproduce harmful hierarchies or be repurposed in supremacist ways. Its authority structures also carried risks familiar in modern spiritual culture: dependency, inner circle politics, the temptation of spectacle, and the tendency to treat criticism as persecution rather than as a prompt for accountability. The movement's history offers repeated examples of sincere ethical aspiration, entangled with power dynamics that could undermine that aspiration. To acknowledge these limits is not to reduce Theosophy to failure. It is to treat it historically and ethically. A movement can be both influential and compromised, both imaginative and harmful, both emancipatory in certain respects and entangled in its era's blind spots. That complexity is precisely why Theosophy is instructive. 5. The question Theosophy leaves behind. Theosophy's long experiment clarifies a question that remains unresolved in modern spiritual life. How can we pursue spiritual depth without surrendering discernment, practice universalism without erasing difference, and cultivate inner transformation without bypassing ethical responsibility? Theosophy attempted to answer this through synthesis. At its best, it insisted that ethics and spiritual seeking must remain bound together, that brotherhood is not sentiment but obligation, and that knowledge without compassion is hollow. At its worst, it substituted hidden authority for open accountability and treated metaphysical explanation as a replacement for moral action. The movement's enduring relevance lies in this tension. It shows how modern spirituality can become a serious moral project, and how easily it can become a theater of certainty. It shows how comparative openness can expand empathy, and how easily it can drift into appropriation. It shows how the desire for proof can be exploited by spectacle, and how the hunger for meaning can make people vulnerable to untested claims. 6. A final assessment. If Theosophy is approached only as scandal or only as wisdom tradition, it will be misunderstood. It must be read as a modern phenomenon shaped by modern conditions: print culture, imperial exchange, scientific prestige, and the changing nature of selfhood, while responding to perennial human questions about suffering, purpose, and moral law. Theosophy did not solve the modern spiritual crisis, but it helped define its terms. It made it possible to imagine a spirituality that is global, evolutionary, and non-sectarian, while also revealing the ethical and political difficulties such a project entails. Its greatest contribution may therefore be neither its doctrines nor its institutions, but its role as an early, influential attempt to hold together realities that modern life often splits apart: reason and wonder, plurality and unity, inner life and social ethics. In the end, Theosophy is a story about longing and structure, hope and contradiction. It reminds us that modernity did not eliminate spiritual hunger. It changed the forms through which that hunger seeks expression. And it leaves us with a task still unfinished: to build ways of seeking that are free but accountable, open but respectful, imaginative but honest, and spiritually ambitious without becoming ethically blind. That task is not only Theosophy's afterlife. It is the ongoing challenge of spiritual modernity itself.